Spider-Man is one of the most iconic characters of all time, appearing in every form of media you could think of. First in comic books, then probably most popular in movies, both live action and animated, but in no other media do you get to feel like the web-slinger himself as you do in video games. So today, we're going to look through every single video game Spider-Man has ever appeared in. Starting off in the year 1982, 20 years after Spider-Man first appeared, with the Atari 2600 game Spider-Man, published by Parker Brothers. Now going forward, I'm going to try to be more specific with release dates for games, but a lot of these early years, all I could find was a year, maybe a month, but exact release dates hard to come by. So, what was the first ever Spider-Man game? What was the story? What did it look like? The story for the game must have just been in the game manual, because there's no way they conveyed the story in this game with what you see on screen. But Norman Osborn gets arrested, then incites a prison riot, escapes, and goes Goblin mode, and is going to blow up the Empire State Building with a super bomb, and Spider-Man goes to stop him. The gameplay consists of Spider-Man just climbing up a building using his web swings, and Spider-Man has a limited web fluid to swing up the wall. As he goes up the wall, criminals pop out of windows, which Spider-Man can hit just by swinging into them to increase the score. To beat the game, all you have to do is just get to the top of the building. There isn't anything special to the gameplay, just simple arcade game style where you just replay over and over again trying to get a high score. Some quick side notes for the game. The Green Goblin villain in this game can be seen in Across the Spider-Verse as one of the prisoners in Miguel O'Hara's Spider Society. And Electronic Fun with Computer and Games rated this game a 3 out of 4, but did call it very derivative of Crazy Climber, which I did look up, and I do very much see the resemblance. And that's pretty much it for the first ever Spider-Man game. Very simple. We're going to see a lot of changes to how Spider-Man games look going forward. But for now, this is the one that started it all. But let's not dwell on the first one too long, and let's move on to the next Spider-Man game. Next, we go to 1984, where we have one game this year, Quest Probe, featuring Spider-Man. This one was released in December of 1984, and this is part of a Quest Probe series, which first featured the Hulk, then this Spider-Man game, then Human Torch and The Thing, but not the whole Fantastic Four. Not sure why they were left out. The married couple was left out. But this game was released to computers and Commodores, and this game was published and developed by Adventure International, designed by Scott Adams. So the general story of this game is Spider-Man is trapped in the Daily Bugle, which he must explore, solve puzzles, and find gems within the building. While exploring, you fight different Spider-Man villains, those being Doc Ock, Lizard, Spider-Man, Electro, Mysterio, Ringmaster, and Chief Examiner, villain in all of the Quest Probe games. This game is a text-based movement and action game, up, down, left, right, north, south, east, west type of movement. Think Zork, but with visuals. Zork being a game I played on the computer in the back of the Black Ops menu screen. The reviews for this game are mostly positives, but there was this. Home Computing Weekly wrote, classy but rather overpriced, recommended for masochists and adventure freaks. Now, from 1984, we would have a 5-year drought of Spider-Man based video games, but coming in 1989, we had The Amazing Spider-Man and Captain America in Doctor Doom's Revenge, being a team-up video game featuring both heroes. This again was released to Commodores and computers, this one being developed and published by Paragon Software, designed by Mark E. Cerament. The story for this game being that Spider-Man and Captain America team up to take on Doctor Doom, with Captain America working his way through Doom's castle to fight him, and Spider-Man fights through enemies to disarm a missile from Doctor Doom, with Mysterio acting as Spider-Man's boss fight. This game is just a side-scrolling arcade-style game that's just boss fight after boss fights. Simple button-mashing, beat-em-up style. With a large list of boss fights in this game, including Rhino, Eduardo Lobo, Grey Gargoyle, Machete, Boomerang, Oddball, Electro, Hobgoblin, Batroc, Zarin, Rattan, Hulk, who was revealed to just be Mysterio, and of course, Doctor Doom. This game had damn near every Marvel villain ever, at least on, obviously, the Captain America and Spider-Man side of things. This game had mixed reviews. The graphics and sound were praised, but it was criticized for poor performance. And the game could come with a comic book that was a prologue for the story of the video game. Now, 1989 is the first year with 2 entries into this list, with this next one being one that Spider-Man appeared in, but was not a focus game, and all of these ones that Spider-Man appears in, but isn't a focus game, I'll attempt to take less time on going forward. This one being 1989's The Revenge of Shinobi, a hack-and-slash side-scrolling Japanese game where Spider-Man makes his small appearance in as a boss who turns out to be a fake, as it's really a shapeshifter pretending to be him, as well as other cultural icons such as Batman and a Rambo-like figure named Rocky. This use of icons caused some legal trouble for the games and different versions of the game depending on where it was released. Then in 1990, we actually had 2 Spider-Man games come out, both with the same exact name. Firstly, I'll start off with the computer version. The Amazing Spider-Man, released on the Commodore 64 and the Amiga, developed by Oxford Digital Enterprises and published by Paragon Softwares. The story of this game is Spider-Man attempting to save his wife, Mary Jane, from Mysterio. To save her, he must complete different puzzles in different rooms and environments to get to her. These rooms are often parodies of different movies, I guess exploring more of Mysterio's practical effects / film effects background in this game. Obviously, the game ends with Spider-Man defeating Mysterio and saving MJ. Now, the game itself is a 2D game, more like a side-scroller, but instead of continuously going to the right, you navigate the given space and solve different puzzles to move forward. Most puzzles just being navigation puzzles, avoiding different things in the environment that could hurt you. Other puzzles being to guide a cart to a specific spot, using buttons to clear paths to then move forward, and others. This is a unique Spider-Man game as you don't actually fight anything. You're supposed to avoid all enemies and don't even fight Mysterio. You just trick him into falling into his own defeat. This game honestly doesn't feel like a Spider-Man game. It seems like a completely different game that got a reskin to be a Spider-Man game to sell more. But that's just my own ideas. Some side notes for the game. Developer Rick Yap said that a beat-em-up seemed boring for someone of Peter Parker's intelligence. So the reasoning makes sense and does show knowledge of the character, but no fighting at all in a superhero game will always seem off to me, besides maybe like an Oracle game. Yap also stated there were 256 frames of animation for Spider-Man, which for the time, or at least the system it was on, was a lot. The game was later ported to other PCs, Atari ST, and Amstrad CPC. And then for the reception of this game, Moby Games says it has a critic score of 62%. This is the average score from across different critics that the site could find. Reviews essentially saying the puzzles were well done and the lesser focus on combat might have been a bit ahead of its time, but the lack of combat in a Spider-Man game does still hurt it, especially for kids, which is the sentiment I saw elsewhere. Different commentators saying they didn't enjoy the game as a kid and were taken a bit back by a lack of combat. So that leaves us with the other Amazing Spider-Man game that came out that year, July's 1990's The Amazing Spider-Man for the Game Boy. This being a Game Boy exclusive developed by Rare and published by LGN. The story for this game being that all of Spider-Man's most dangerous supervillains have found out his secret identity as Peter Parker and have captured his wife, Mary Jane. She cannot catch a break in these games. Then it's just a cycle of Spider-Man getting calls from his villains who are taunting him and telling him where to go, where he beats them, then gets calls from another villain until Peter finally faces off with Venom, the final villain, and saves MJ, ending the game. This game is just a simple side-scrolling beat-em-up. Every level is just some normal goon fights, then fighting the level's supervillain at the end. Some variants in the levels, like one you will wall climb and dodge obstacles to get to the fight, or ride the top of a train. The supervillains of this game include Mysterio, Hobgoblin, Scorpion, Rhino, Doc Ock, and then finally Venom. Not much else to say about the gameplay, as the game can be completed in under 25 minutes. And this game did spawn 2 sequels that I'll get into later, with the reception of this game being average critic score of 64%. Consensus being it's good, mindless fun that doesn't do anything new or push the genre in any way, but doesn't do anything truly bad. But this then leads us into 1991, the year of 3 games with Spider-Man in them. For the first game of 1991, releasing in I think the earlier part of 1991, we have Spider-Man vs. Kingpin. This was a Sega Genesis game that was later ported to the Master System, the Game Gear, and the Sega CD. It was developed by Technopop and published by Sega. The story for this game being that Kingpin plants a bomb in New York City, and Spider-Man must make his way through a lot of his biggest supervillains to retrieve keys to disarm the bomb. These villains being Doc Ock, Electro, Lizard, Sandman, Hobgoblin, Venom, and of course, finally, Kingpin. Wikipedia and Sega Retro have different synopsis of the plot, with the Wikipedia leaving out the bomb and focusing more on MJ's capture and villains reforming to help Spider-Man, but all the gameplay I've seen backs up the Sega Retro plot. So that's what I've told you. A lot of these earlier games, information is weird to find about. But the gameplay for this is just another simple side-scrolling platform game where you can just kind of jump around, very simple web swinging and wall climbing, and just beat 'em up combat style. Later ports for the game did add some new things to the game, with Bullseye being added in, having to save MJ from an acid pit in one port, which might be what the Wikipedia was referencing, and an Ultra mode where you have to defeat Venom after every round in the game. Just essentially a super hard mode. This game only has one review that I could find in Hyper, an Australian gaming magazine, which gave the game a 73%. But I also saw reviews of the later ports of the game saying it did a great job recreating and adding to the game. Another game with Spider-Man in it in 1991 was The Punisher, The Ultimate Payback. This being one that just Spider-Man appears in, but is not a main game of his. But Spider-Man appears in this game as an ally of Frank Castle as he fights crime, only appearing in between stages to offer Frank Castle words of advice. The game was a Game Boy exclusive. Kind of interesting that the most violent Marvel character had a Game Boy game. Also makes sense that Spider-Man will make an appearance in a Punisher game, as the Punisher's first appearance was in a Spider-Man comic, where he was originally hunting down the Spider. And then the final game of 1991 was September's Spider-Man the Video Game. This being an arcade game developed and published by Sega. The story for this game being that Spider-Man and his allies must retrieve a mystical artifact from Dr. Doom as they fight through waves of grunts and supervillains at the end of each round. You can play as either Spider-Man, Black Cat, Hawkeye, or Namor the Submariner. The enemies you fight through are Kingpin, pretty big year for him in 1991, and then Venom, Doc Ock, Electro, Lizard, Scorpion, Sandman, Green Goblin, Hobgoblin, and then finally Dr. Doom. This game is a simple side-scrolling, wait for it, beat 'em up, but this one is an actual arcade game and is coin-based, meaning I can comfortably guarantee you can't beat this game without dying, as the arcade needed you to die so you can keep putting in coins so they can make money. This game kept track of high scores by character, so you could see the specific scores for every game, and this game reused some of the soundtrack of a previous arcade game, Quartet. This arcade game sold very well, being the 14th highest sold arcade game in its first full month in Japan. In Australia, it was the top-selling conversion kit in November 1991. Conversion kits just being what changes the game an arcade machine plays, and an issue of Computers and Video Games included a positive review of the game, praising the graphics. And I'll just take their word for it. Now, the year is 1992. This is another year where we have 3 games with Spider-Man in them this year. Starting off with a sequel to one we saw previously, The Amazing Spider-Man 2, a sequel to The Amazing Spider-Man for the Game Boy from 1990. This one is also a Game Boy exclusive. This one was developed by Bits and published by Acclaim Entertainment. The story for this game is Spider-Man is framed for a bank robbery by his enemies, and he must clear his name. For the gameplay, this is again another side-scroller where you fight through thugs most of the stages for a final boss at the end of the stage. The villains for this one include Hobgoblin, Lizard, Graviton, and Carnage, who's the face of the game, being on the cover art, but Mysterio actually acts as the final boss of the game. Spider-Man also has to collect various objects in his stage to complete puzzles. Now, interesting side note is that they had switched developers between this one and the previous game in the series, but ultimately it doesn't look really any different at all. This game received split reviews, some positive, some negative, but most reviews clear the 50% mark. So we're looking at a pretty okay game, mid at best. The next game to come out in 1992 was Spider-Man: Return of the Sinister Six, that came out in October of the year. This game was released to the NES and the Master System, and this one was also developed by Bit Studios and Acclaim Entertainment, meaning that the same exact publisher and developer combination released two games in the same calendar year. Very interesting. The story for this one is that Doc Ock reassembles the Sinister Six in an attempt to take over the world. There's not a lot of depth to this game, and Spider-Man must defeat them all, which he does and saves the day. Apparently, this story is loosely based on a comic run of the same name in the early 90s. Issues The Amazing Spider-Man 334 to 339 to be specific. For the gameplay, you're not going to guess it. It is a side-scrolling beat-em-up. Predictably, fight some grunts, then one of the Sinister Six at the end of each level, with Doc Ock being the final boss. The other Sinisters being Electro, Sandman, Mysterio, Vulture, and Hobgoblin. And I'm starting to notice that Hobgoblin is getting a lot more run than the Green Goblin in video games so far. And that's something to keep an eye out to see how much that holds up, or at the very least, how much longer that holds up. A quick side note is that apparently the Master System port of this game is much easier, making certain items easier to get and removing some enemies. Nintendo Power complimented the game for its graphics, but did criticize the controls of the game, saying there's a disconnect from what feels should happen based on how you play versus what actually happens. Now, for the final Spider-Man game of 1992. Releasing in November, we have Spider-Man and the X-Men in Arcade's Revenge, a crossover game between Spider-Man and obviously the X-Men. This was released to the NES and later ported to the Game Boy, the Genesis, and the Game Gear. This one was developed by Software Creations, but also, once again, published by Acclaim Entertainment. The story for this game is that Spider-Man notices the disappearance of multiple X-Men and tracks them down to the enemy Arcade. Because the game got its name from the villain and not a system it's on. I totally expected this to be an arcade game based on the name, but it's not. That's just the name of the villain. But anyway, he puts Spider-Man, Storm, Cyclops, Wolverine, and Gambit into a simulation called the Murder World, a torture simulation made by Arcade. Each hero then has two of their own levels that the player must complete to then cause the final level, where you play as Spider-Man to complete the last objective and escape the simulation. After escaping the simulation, Arcade plays a recording, taunting the heroes, then starting a countdown. The heroes get out in time, but the building they were in explodes, ending the game. For the gameplay, it's just these heroes facing different challenges. The challenges the heroes face are more traversal puzzles than real combat, even though there are still fights. Like Storm has to navigate being completely in water, and Cyclops rides a rail cart and uses his laser vision to clear himself a path. Now, the finale stage is a boss fight with Spider-Man taking on a giant robo-arcade, I think. Interesting note is that all characters share lives, so if one hero loses a life, all heroes lose a life. Another interesting side note is that this game was influenced by the X-Men cartoon that was airing at this time. One of the best theme songs of all time. Highly regarded cartoon, and it's actually kind of coming back with X-Men 95 on Disney Plus at some point. Definitely going to check that out. The average rating for this game seems to sit around the 70s, with Super Gamer giving the game a 75%, saying the gameplay is varied and tough and the graphics are impressive. And that wraps up the year of 1992 for Spider-Man video games. Alright, so now the year is 1993, and we have one lone Spider-Man game. That being The Amazing Spider-Man 3 Invasion of the Spider Slayers. This being the third and final game in the Bit Studios and Acclaim Entertainment's Game Boy Spider-Man series. This one loosely being based on the comic storyline of the same name. Spider-Man is just out spidering around when he begins to be attacked by different high-tech robot spider slayers. Spider-Man fights through the waves of robots with run-ins against Electro and Scorpion until ultimately fighting the man behind the robots, Alistair Smith, a villain he must have put behind bars before, as he says he developed his plan to create the robots and kill Spider-Man while behind bars. But of course his plan fails and Spider-Man saves the day, with the final lines of this children's game being, in reference to Spider-Man, "He feels no triumph, no rush of victory, only sickness of near loss of life, and a bone-weary relief that at last it's over." Crazy line to drop at the end of this Game Boy Spider-Man trilogy that is like 20 minutes long each game. insane ending. But the gameplay for this is the exact same as all the other ones in this line, just a side-scrolling beat 'em up. Punches, kicking, climbing, and some web slings. This game was criticized for its poor graphics, grammatical errors, and just being difficult to play. But that ends out this year with just one measly Spider-Man game. But now we move on to 1994, where we have a pair of Spider-Man games. The first one being released September 16th, 1994. This is the first game I could find a full release date for. That being Spider-Man and Venom: Maximum Carnage. Released to the SNES and Genesis, developed by Software Creations and published once again by Acclaim Entertainment. The story for this game is that Eddie Brock is proven innocent while in jail and gets to leave. Before he does, the Venom symbiote has a kid and bonds to Eddie's cellmate, Cletus Cassidy, becoming Carnage. While Eddie toys with the idea of using the Venom symbiote for good, he has a run-in with Spider-Man, as Spider-Man wants him to turn his life around, but they get interrupted by Carnage. Venom fights Carnage, but Carnage ends up fleeing and starts a criminal empire in the sewers, with Shriek as his second-in-command. Hobgoblin gets demonic powers and becomes Demogoblin and joins Carnage's crew. Carnage then recruits four-armed Spider-Man clone named Doppelganger and Carrion, a Jackal clone. Carnage then takes his team and attacks New York City, causing Spider-Man and Venom to put aside their differences and work together to fight Carnage's team. Spider-Man and Venom take on the Carnage team and get beat and have to retreat. But Venom and Spider-Man put together their own resistance team to take on and defeat Carnage. We see Carnage get away, but the game ends with Spider-Man telling Venom he hopes they can work together in the future, but Venom leaves him. This is the first game where we see Venom in a more protagonist role, which has become increasingly popular today, but this is the first time we really see it play out in video games. But for the gameplay, this is a side-scrolling beat-em-up where you play different levels as either Spider-Man or Venom, fighting through waves of enemies, fighting members of Carnage's team until the final battle. You can recruit other heroes in the game to help you out, although you can only play as Spider-Man and Venom. These heroes being Captain America, Black Cat, Iron Fist, Cloak and Dagger, Deathlock, Morbius, and Firestar. So this game was noted as being one of the first video games to be based on a comic storyline. And since we've already seen some games loosely based off of comic storylines, I'm assuming this one is just more directly based on a storyline, and hence the note for it. As some of the cutscenes from this game are directly taken from stills from the comics. This is also the first Spider-Man game to be given a teen rating, which just makes sense. If you're going to have Venom, you're going to have Carnage, you got to up it a little bit. Which this game apparently did. Looking at the reviews from Electronic Gaming Monthly, Nintendo Power, and GamePro, the game was an average or mediocre game, where the story and superhero cameos of the game were praised, but the graphics and controls were criticized. Also, the Genesis version is seemingly the better version, as Game Rankings gave the SNES a 66% and the Genesis version an 80%. Pretty big difference. Then, for the final game in 1994, we have just plain Spider-Man. Released to the SNES in 1994, and then to the Genesis in 1995. Developed by Western Technologies and published by Acclaim Entertainment. The story for this game is that Doc Ock is in prison, mad, and escapes and plans to get his revenge. Then Oscorp goes under, causing Norman to become the Green Goblin again. Both then coincidentally attack the city at the same time and decide to partner up. Together they hire Matt Gargan and get Dr. Connors to turn him into the Scorpion. Later, Spider-Man gets jumped by Doc Ock, Green Goblin, Scorpion, the Lizard, Spider Slayers, and Alistair Smith as a cyborg, forming the new Sinister Six with robot goons. And they beat the shit out of Spider-Man, but he swears he'll defeat them. So he works his way through the city, beating the villains till he gets to their base, where he defeats Goblin and Ock. But then Ock releases the Venom symbiote in this game made from the Goblin formula in Spider-Man's DNA. And the symbiote attaches itself to one of the Spider Slayer robots, who Spider-Man beats, but the symbiote gets away. Then the villains are arrested, and the Bugle credits Captain America with saving the day. But the gameplay is this is a side-scrolling platformer, nice little beat-em-up. First one I've noticed with coins in the game. And then there's only 6 levels in the SNES version, but there's also only 5 in the Genesis version, so this is not a long game. One side note I wanted to say is that I never heard of Alistair Smith before I started working on this video, and he gets hella play in these games. This game got ripped, the animation in this game being called poor and limited, sound also criticized for being lackluster, and the combat being very basic. So probably the weaker of the two games to come out in 1994, but we chug along ahead to another year. Alright, it's now 1995, and we have another pair of Spider-Man video games this year. Starting off with The Amazing Spider-Man Lethal Foes, released March 17th, 1995. Released to the Super Famicom. This is the first game I believe to be a one-country exclusive, or at the very least be a Japanese exclusive. I guess the Japanese Spider-Man show had more influence than I thought. But the game was developed by Argent and published by Epoch Co. Alright, so for this one we have another Doc Ock escaping from prison storyline and getting some villains together, all to fight Spider-Man, starting off with the Lizard. Doc Ock gets scientist Smith to create the Spider Slayer robots. We then see Spider-Man attempt to prevent a bank robbery by Beetle, but gets jumped by the Spider Bots, which he destroys. Beetle escapes and starts working with Doc Ock. Mysterio then traps Spider-Man, who breaks free, defeats Mysterio, and finds a GPS that tracks Doc's arms. Doc Ock then realizes someone is tracking him and gets new Mach 2 arms. And Doc Ock then forces Smith to become a human Spider-Slayer hybrid. Spider-Man then tracks the GPS to Ock's old arms and gets ambushed by Smith, who Spider-Man beats. But then Doc Ock sends Green Goblin to attack Spider-Man, who he chases through New York City. But Venom attacks Goblin, who Spider-Man stops. Eddie Brock warns Spider-Man of Carnage and his plan to destroy New York. Doc Ock then attacks, but Doc Ock's new arms explode, causing Spider-Man to celebrate his victory prematurely as Carnage begins to attack. Spider-Man defeats Carnage. Spider-Man to save the day. For the gameplay, it's still just side-scrolling, with Spider-Man beating up his enemies. This time, the game does have checkpoints throughout the levels that the player can activate. Spider-Man can web-sling, wall crawl, punch, and kick. Spider-Man takes on Spider Slayers, Beetle, Lizard, Mysterio, Alistair Smith, Green Goblin, Scorpion, Venom, Doc Ock, and Carnage. Maybe the most villains you can fight in one game so far. And on release, Famicom Tsushin, I don't know if I said that right, Japanese video game magazine scored the game a 21 out of 40. Not the best review, but let's keep going. Now, this next game in 1995 isn't truly a Spider-Man game, as it's Venom Spider-Man Separation Anxiety, released November of 1995 to the Genesis, the SNES, and later ported to the PC. Developed by Software Creations and published by Acclaim Entertainment. And I believe this is the last game made by Acclaim Entertainment. But the story for this game is just that Venom has to take on all his symbiote spawns made due to the Life Foundation, with the help of Spider-Man. This is a 2D side-scrolling beat-em-up. Tired of hearing me say that? I'll probably keep saying it some more. But this one adds the ability to move up to progress in the game, meaning it's not quite the left-to-right linear play we've seen before. And now, while Spider-Man is still featured prominently in this game, it is much more of a Venom game, and this is the first video game that is truly his, although he's been a main and playable character before. This game didn't seem to be received too highly, Electronic Gaming Monthly saying the game wasn't much fun, with boring combat and repetitive fights, and then a critic for Next Generation saying the game's music and graphics were on par with Maximum Carnage, but didn't do anything new. Also, according to Game Rankings, the game's SNES version was noticeably better than the Genesis version, with the SNES getting a 61.5% and the Genesis version getting a 35.85%. An insane difference in ratings. But that ends it for 1995 for Spider-Man games. And they are really churning out Spider-Man games, as 1996 also has 2 Spider-Man games to come out. Starting off with The Amazing Spider-Man Web of Fire. This was released on the 32X, a Sega Genesis add-on to boost the power of the system. Viewed as like a transitional console. That concept kind of ahead of its time. Think maybe more PS4 Pro, Switch OLED, although not a separate system itself. This game was developed by Blue Sky Software and Zono, and was published by Sega. The story for this one is that Hydra and a group called the New Enforcers take over New York City and plan to blanket the city with a plasma grid, and Spider-Man has to destroy all the generators and defeat the New Enforcers that guard them. which Spider-Man does, and we have a final countdown run before an explosion to end the game, with all the cutscenes about the Hydra attack being shown through the newspapers. We're still side-scrolling. Spider-Man is punching, kicking. He also has a web-shot projectile with web fluid cartridges you can grab in the stage. This game might genuinely have the best web swinging in any Spider-Man game yet, which isn't saying much, but it's better. Also, you can call in Daredevil for a special attack once you free him in the first stage and use Daredevil coins. This game has a difficulty level, and this is the first game I've seen that has one. Could be a previous one that did, but I couldn't find it. This was also the last game, period, to be released to the 32X in North America. This game had very little coverage upon release, most likely due to Sega announcing they were done with the 32X, but the game was given positive reviews, but not said to be groundbreaking. Then, to end 1996, we have Spider-Man: The Sinister Six. This one was a disc game for the PC, developed by Brooklyn Multimedia and published by Byron Preiss Multimedia. And honestly, guys, I couldn't really find anything clear about the game. No normal wiki. Marvel Database barely has anything on this game. So this is what I could piece together. So the story is that Peter Parker tracks down the Sinister Six and then switches over to being Spider-Man to actually take them on. We see the player given choices as Peter on how to investigate things. Spider-Man takes on the Sinister Six one-on-one and defeats them. The six being Chameleon, Shocker, Hobgoblin, Mysterio, Vulture, and Doc Ock. For the gameplay, you actually play as Peter Parker for most of this game, it seems, as you play a point-and-click game with some choices on what to do as you go through Peter's life, his relationship with MJ, and track down the Sinister Six. Then the Spider-Man play varies based on what's happening. It's not a set style of combat throughout the whole game. As most is probably a point-and-shoot game with his webs, or dodging tentacles in an elevator shaft, the action seems segmented just for those individual fights. And I think this is the first game you actually get to play as Peter Parker in like a Peter mode. This game seems to be kind of buried. I wonder why. Probably because it's not remembered fondly. Only reviews I could find are on Google, and it's ripped for bad visuals and says nothing really interesting happens. I wonder if it was received this poorly when it came out. I'm guessing yes, due to how hard it is to find anything on it, and it caused a 4-year gap between dedicated Spider-Man games. But for the year 1998, we do have a game with Spider-Man in it, but it is once again not a Spider-Man game, with Marvel vs. Capcom Clash of Superheroes, released January 23rd, 1998. First it was released to the arcade, then the Dreamcast in 99, the PlayStation in 2000, then the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 in 2012. This game was developed and published by Capcom. This is a typical arcade fighting game with Spider-Man as a playable character, as well as Venom. But now we enter the new millennia in the year 2000, where September 1st, 2000, we got plain old Spider-Man. First released on the PlayStation and Game Boy Color, then the N64 later in the year. Dreamcast and Windows in 2001, and then Mac in 2002. Developed by Neversoft and published by Activision. The game kicks off with a reformed Doc Ock holding a science expo that gets attacked and robbed by a fake Spider-Man, who breaks Eddie Brock's camera during the incident, causing the Venom symbiote to come back out of him. Spider-Man gets framed for the attack, and a manhunt for him starts. We then see Spider-Man stop a bank robbery with Black Cat. God damn! Spider-Man saves J. Jonah Jameson from the Scorpion, but in Jameson fashion, he calls the police on him. Spider-Man then has a run-in with Daredevil, who says he'll spread the word of Spider-Man's innocence. Spider-Man then catches back up with Black Cat and takes down the Rhino, who they defeat, but Black Cat takes a beating and gets kidnapped by fake paramedics. But then Spider-Man gets jumped by Venom, causing a chase, with Spider-Man going after Venom. During the chase, Spider-Man runs into the Lizard, who was captured by Venom. So the Lizard points Spider-Man towards Venom's lair, where Spider-Man frees Mary Jane and defeats Venom. Spider-Man then convinces Venom he was framed, so Venom agrees to team up with him, so both go to the Bugle to investigate, but Venom leaves because he senses carnage somewhere, leaving Spider-Man to investigate alone. Spider-Man eventually finds the imposter, who turns out to be, guess now, Mysterio, who Spider-Man beats and finds out was hired to distract Spider-Man while his employer infects people with symbiotes. Then we see Punisher attack Spider-Man, but then Spider-Man then convinces him he's innocent. But Spider-Man moves on to a warehouse where he finds a symbiote manufacturer. Spider-Man destroys the manufacturer and rescues Black Cat and finds the masterminds, Doc Ock and Carnage. Venom then joins in on the action, with Spider-Man taking on Doc Ock and Venom taking on Carnage. Doc Ock and Venom are defeated, leading to Spider-Man taking on Carnage, who he defeats, which leads the Carnage symbiote to fuse to Doc Ock, creating Monster Ock. Spider-Man has to run from the monster he can't beat, but the building explodes, separating the symbiote from Doc, ending the game. This game is the first fully 3D Spider-Man, causing the gameplay to feel more like Spider-Man than any other game to this point. Spider-Man can web up his enemies using web fluid, punch, kick, web swing, and wall crawl. Then, comic book collectibles can be found that unlock alternate suits to be worn. 2099, Ben O'Reilly, and civilian Peter Parker. Game has normal boss fights, destroy object levels, survive till the end of the road levels. Pretty standard stuff. This was the first Activision game since they acquired the rights to Spider-Man. Game uses the same engine as Tony Hawk Pro Skater. Lizard was supposed to be a boss fight in the sewer, but due to time constraints it was cut. Some of the voice actors from both Spider-Man and Spider-Man Unlimited cartoons reprise their roles. For instance, Rhino Romano reprises his role as Spider-Man/Peter Parker from Spider-Man Unlimited. This game was praised when it came out and still very respected. Game Rankings gave the PlayStation 87%. IGN gave the game a 9 out of 10, saying it might be the greatest Spider-Man game ever. Spider-Man's PlayStation version received a Platinum Sales Award from the Entertainment and Leisure Software Publishers Association, indicating sales of at least 300,000 copies in the UK. This game spawned multiple sequels that we will get into. Then also in the year 2000, we got Marvel vs. Capcom 2, New Age of Heroes. This was first released to arcades in 2000. Then, also later, the Dreamcast on March 30th of 2000, PlayStation 2 and Xbox on September 19th, 2002, Xbox Live Arcade in July 29th, 2009, PlayStation Network in August 13th, 2009, and then iOS for April 25th, 2012. This game was developed and published by Capcom. This is a sequel to the previous Marvel vs. Capcom game, and this once again has Spider-Man as a playable character. Then we come to the year 2001, which is another big year for Spider-Man games, with 3 games released, all being sequels to the same game, interestingly enough. Starting off with Spider-Man 2, The Sinister Six. This game was released May 23, 2001, only to the Game Boy Color, was developed by Tauros Games and published by Activision. This is a sequel to the 2000 Spider-Man game, specifically just the Game Boy version of that game. In this one, the Sinister Six captures Aunt May, and Spider-Man has to defeat them to save his aunt. Spider-Man fights one member of the Six at a time, with each one giving clues towards the next villain, including fighting Vulture at the Twin Towers in 2001. Final fight being Doc Ock at ESU, where Spider-Man beats him and saves his aunt, ending the game. This game is a side-scrolling platformer with simple combat, punch, kick, web swing, and the use of his web shooters to stun his enemies. Every stage is Spider-Man having to beat one of the Sinister Six, but first must either find keys or defeat certain enemies to get to the Sinister member. The game rankings for this score is 70%, just a simple, fun game. Next up, we have Spider-Man, Mysterio's Menace, released September 18th of 2001. This game was released to the Game Boy Advance, and this is once again a sequel to the Spider-Man 2000 game. Again, I'm going to assume it's the Game Boy version of that game. It's a sequel too. This was developed by Vicarious Visions and published by Activision. Game starts out with MJ telling Peter they need a new fishbowl for their fish. Then a news report causes Spider-Man to investigate the crime reports, causing him to take on a handful of his enemies in one night, fighting Rhino, Hammerhead, Big Wheel, Electro, Scorpion, and finally, Mysterio. Spider-Man defeats all his villains, including Mysterio, in the final stage. And while Mysterio gets away, he leaves his helmet behind. Spider-Man brings back to MJ as their fishbowl for their fish. This game is the typical platformer, side-scrolling, beat-em-up Spider-Man game. Dodging razors or fires as you go through the stage, fighting smaller criminals with a supervillain boss at the end. There's 7 stages, with Hammerhead at the end of 2 stages. This game does have an upgrade system to upgrade attack, health, and webs, with the final upgrade being the symbiote suit, which replenishes health over time on its own. This game had pretty good reviews, with Metacritic having it sit at an 84. Then, for the final game of 2001, we have Spider-Man 2, Enter Electro, released October 18th, 2001. This game was released on PlayStation, and this one is a sequel to the PlayStation version of Spider-Man 2000. It was developed by Vicarious Visions and published by Activision. The story for this one is that Electro has been leading robberies in New York City, and Spider-Man catches one in the act and follows the goons back to a warehouse and fights the Shocker. Spider-Man tracks the criminal activities to a train yard owned by Hammerhead, where he fights the Sandman. Then later the Beetle. While Beetle escapes, he leaves clues behind for Spider-Man. A ball party, where Hammerhead takes people hostage, who Spider-Man frees and defeats Hammerhead. But during the fight, Sandman captures Dr. Watts. Spider-Man wants to learn about Dr. Watts from her colleague, Dr. Connors, but he's already gone lizard mode. Who Spider-Man defeats and gives an antidote to and learns of Electro's plans. Dr. Watts has a device that will amplify his powers. Spider-Man confronts Electro, and Spider-Man gets his hand on the device before Electro can. But Electro uses the hostage to force Spider-Man to give him the device, turning Electro into Hyper Electro. Spider-Man uses generators to depower Hyper Electro, allowing Spider-Man to defeat him. Next day, the Daily Bugle credits Thor with saving the day. The gameplay for this one is the exact same as Spider-Man 2000, which makes sense as this game came out only 1 year after the first one. There were some combat additions like a web ball attack and the ability to add lightning and ice to his webs. Quick side note, the final stage for this game was going to take place on the Twin Towers, but due to something that happened in September of that year, they had to change it to just another skyscraper. This game mostly had positive reviews, but less than the first game. Gameplay, visuals, and sound were praised, but most critics saw the story of this game being disappointing when compared to the first one. But that's it for the year 2001, as we move on to my birth year of 2002. Then, in 2002, on April 16th, we got the movie tie-in game Spider-Man, released 2 weeks before the film. This was released on PlayStation 2, GameCube, Xbox, Windows, and Game Boy Advance. Developed by Treyarch and published by Activision. In this game, Peter Parker gets his spider powers with a tutorial with Bruce Campbell. Spider-Man wrestles, gets cheated by the promoter, and lets him get robbed, but the robber ends up killing Uncle Ben, who tells him with great power comes great responsibility, which causes him to become Spider-Man. A story we all know very well. Peter then gets a job at the Daily Bugle. Later, Norman Osborn, who's trying to create a super soldier serum, sees Spider-Man and sends robots after him because Norman wants to use him to make the serum. But Spider-Man destroys the robots, then has a run-in with Vulture and Shocker and beats them both separately. Norman then sends Spider-Bots after Spider-Man, but they accidentally track down Scorpion instead. Spider-Man helps Scorpion defeat the bots, but then Scorpion's paranoia gets the better of him and fights Spider-Man and loses, but manages to escape. Then, Norman Osborn tests a super soldier serum on himself, going extra crazy and becoming the Green Goblin. Norman then attacks an Oscorp event, and MJ, Peter's crush, gets caught in the chaos, and Spider-Man intervenes and saves MJ. MJ kisses Spider-Man, iconic in the movie, not as good here. Spider-Man then fights and beats Green Goblin, who then offers Spider-Man to join him, but obviously refuses. Goblin reveals he's planted bombs across the city, allowing him to escape, while Spider-Man goes to defuse them all. Spider-Man analyzes the Goblin tech post-fight and sees it was made by Oscorp, so he goes and investigates the Oscorp building and learns that Goblin knows about MJ and has kidnapped her to lure out Spider-Man. So Spider-Man goes and saves MJ and beats Goblin, who ends up killing himself on accident with the glider. Game ends with a fourth wall break as Spider-Man tells the player to go outside and play.
Looks like you're done now. Go outside and play.
Kinda corny. This game is a level-based game with mostly indoor missions, where you either have to move through the stage to a location, fight through a certain amount of enemies, or defeat the supervillain boss for the stage. You could web swing or zip, punch, kick, jump, camera lock, which I think might be a new feature for a Spider-Man game, and wall crawling. The game allows for different skins to be unlocked, including Green Goblin, which allows you to replay the story, but this time as Harry Osborn, as you become the Green Goblin after your father dies. Lastly, for gameplay, all I'll say is the web swinging looks terrible. This was the first movie tie-in game that we've seen on this list, but there will be many more to come. Also, the Xbox version also has exclusive Kraven content, where Norman hires him to hunt down Spider-Man. Also, you can unlock Mary Jane as a skin to play, but was dropped in later versions for lesbianism, as you could have a Mary Jane on Mary Jane kiss. The game was a massive commercial success. The reviews for the game were pretty positive, as Metacritic has the game ranking in the high 70s across all platforms. The complaints for the game were poor indoor levels, bad voice acting from Toby,
The last time I saw Uncle Ben alive, we argued.
and difficult camera. Then, 2 years later, in 2004, we went from one movie tie-in game to another with June 29th, Spider-Man 2. Released to PlayStation 2, Xbox, GameCube, Windows, Mac, and Engage, a Nokia smartphone, as well as the Game Boy Advance, DS, and PSP. Developed by Treyarch and published by Activision. I don't know if I've said this before, but anytime I do these games, I'm going to talk about the main version. So we're in an era where a lot of these games are like titled and released the same, but the handheld versions are a extremely different version from the console version. But I'm just going to talk about the main versions of each game. So in this game, we see Peter is struggling to balance being Spider-Man and Peter, as his hero duties interfere with his friendships with MJ and Harry, who blames Spider-Man for his father's death. Then, Spider-Man stops a bank robbery from Black Cat, and they friend each other, and Black Cat will help Spider-Man a couple of times through the game. Spider-Man then fights and beats the Rhino, then is challenged by a series of tests from Quentin Beck, special effects artist, to prove Spider-Man is a fraud. But Spider-Man prevails, embarrassing Beck, which causes him to take on the identity of Mysterio and stage a couple of attacks. But Spider-Man ultimately beats him, but Mysterio manages to escape. Harry then introduces Peter to Dr. Octavius, who starts to mentor Peter. But then, in a public experiment with tentacle arms and a reactor, things go wrong, causing the arms AI to take over Octavius, and he becomes Dr. Octopus, who then decides to rob a bank to fund another experiment. But while there, Peter and Aunt May are also there. So Peter suits up, fights Ock, who takes May hostage, and while Peter saves May, Ock gets away. Peter learns MJ is getting married, and he then reunites with Black Cat, who tries to convince him to be Spider-Man full-time, and they take down the Shocker together. Spider-Man tells her he has to continue living his double life, and Black Cat leaves. Spider-Man then takes down Mysterio again and unmasks him, and Peter takes pictures of the event for the Bugle, and Jameson uses the pics to make it seem like Spider-Man and Mysterio were working together. Doc Ock needs a special isotope to fuel his reactor and makes an agreement with Harry Osborn for it, if Doc Ock gives Harry Spider-Man. And Harry tells Ock to go to Peter, who takes his pictures. So Doc Ock attacks Peter, captures MJ, and tells Peter to tell Spider-Man he's looking for him. Spider-Man fights Doc Ock on a subway train, which go off its controls, causing Spider-Man to have to stop the train, tiring him, allowing Doc Ock to capture Spider-Man and bring him to Harry. Harry is about to kill Spider-Man but unmask him, and is shocked to see it's Peter. Peter convinces Harry to point him to Ock's lair, which he does. Peter goes and fights Ock, but is able to convince him what he's doing is wrong, and takes control of himself, and Octavius sacrifices himself to destroy the reactor. And Spider-Man saves MJ, and she learns of his secret identity. Game ends with MJ leaving her wedding to be with Peter. I think the story for this game seemed to be a lot more faithful to what the movie was in comparison with the first one. But for the gameplay, this one was a open world game where you're able to travel to the objectives across the map to start the main mission, and are given side objectives from civilians throughout the map. We get typical spider combat with spider sense in this game, allowing you to slow down time and dodge attacks. I think this is the first game to do that. The web swinging in this game was revolutionary, having the best physics ever for web swinging, with Spider-Man's webs actually attaching to buildings, determining where he was swinging from. And for the longest time was considered the standard for Spider-Man web swinging. I think factoring in this game's open world, the side missions, and this web swinging, this might be, up till this point, the most important Spider-Man game ever. The most influential ever. High praise, but I truly do believe that. Some side notes, the story of the game and the non-console version are mostly the same but shorter versions of the story, although the portable version adds in the Vulture to the game. This is also the first open-world Spider-Man game has ever had, which would become the norm and change the series forever. The game was very well received, with the console versions of the game sitting in the 80s on Metacritic, but in the 60s for the portable versions. The web swinging was praised, but repetitive side quests criticized. This resulted in the game being a massive commercial success. Now, we had no games in between Spider-Man 1 and 2, but we have some in between 2 and 3. Now it's the year 2005, where we have 3 games with Spider-Man in them. Starting off with Spider-Man and Friends, released January 11th, 2005, released exclusively to Windows. This game was developed and published by Activision. This game was a simple child learning game where they can learn simple puzzle solving, math, language, and pattern recognition using their favorite superheroes. Marvel superheroes featured, those being Spider-Man, Wolverine, Spider-Girl, who's Peter's cousin in this world. As much as Spider-Man has been liked and his games played by kids, this is easily the most child-targeted and child-friendly one that his games have ever been. Also, the first Spider-Man game without any real antagonist. Then, September 20th, 2005, we have Marvel Nemesis, Rise of the Imperfects, this one not being a dedicated Spider-Man game. This was released to the GameCube, PlayStation 2, Xbox, PSP, and the Nintendo DS. Developed by Nihilistic Software, published by Electronic Arts. The story is that aliens are invading Earth and use devices to mind control different Marvel heroes, causing them to fight each other until enough heroes are freed from the control to defeat the aliens. It's a one-on-one fighting game that allows for full movement around the arena and not just a 2D fighting space like most games. A simple fighting game style combat that do have fatality-like finishing moves once the opponent's health gets below 25%. Obviously, Spider-Man is one of the characters in the game you can play as. Others include Venom, Captain America, Magneto, Daredevil, and more. The game actually had a tie-in prequel comic book series. The game received pretty mediocre reviews. According to Metacritic, the console version of the game all received scores in the 50s, with the handheld versions receiving even worse reviews. The biggest complaints were the AI. Mainly they would spam projectile moves, which sounds like what human players would do if this game had an online mode. So maybe the AI was perfectly spot on. Then, to wrap up the year, we have Ultimate Spider-Man, released September 22nd, 2005. This was released to the PlayStation 2, the Xbox, GameCube, Windows, Game Boy Advance, and DS. This game was developed by Treyarch and published by Activision. This game is a tie-in game to the comics, it seems, picking up after the Venom story arc from the Ultimate Spider-Man comics. The game recaps Peter's first fight with Venom, where he thought Venom died. Game actually picks up 3 months later with Spider-Man thinking Venom is dead, but actually he's been hiding and feeding on people, getting stronger, which is proven in his fight with Wolverine. Spider-Man then takes down a version of the Rhino. Venom then has a run-in with Silver Sable, but escapes. Spider-Man and Venom then have their first fight at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, but ends with Venom being captured by Silver Sable. With some coaxing from Adrian Toomes and Boulevard Trask, Eddie tests out his suit and fights Electro in the square. S.H.I.E.L.D. interferes with the fight, causing Venom to flee and go back to Trask, where he reveals to the Wild Pack that Peter Parker is Spider-Man. But then Venom escapes the Wild Pack. Then a mercenary called Beetle joins the game by freeing Green Goblin, who Spider-Man takes down, and Beetle then tries to get a sample of Venom's symbiote, but Venom defeats him. Spider-Man and Venom then both fight Sable's forces, then each other, and both knock each other out. Both are captured, and Spider-Man is injected with a sample of the symbiote, turning into Carnage. Venom absorbs the Carnage symbiote, spitting Peter out and forming a spider symbol on Venom's chest. Spider-Man then defeats Venom finally, and the game ends with Peter learning that the reason the plane crash that killed his and Eddie's parents was caused by Eddie's father trying on the Venom symbiote on board the plane, causing the crash that killed them all. I think the only other piece of media that I can remember where Eddie and Peter's parents knew each other and were killed in a plane crash together was Spectacular Spider-Man. So that must be a Ultimate Spider-Man storyline. Very interesting. But for the gameplay, you actually swap around playing as both Spider-Man and Venom, the first time you've been able to do that in a third-person game. Spider-Man web swings to move around and has to actually web to a building, just like in Spider-Man 2. Venom uses his tentacle to perform massive jumps around. Spider-Man punches, kicks, web shoots to fight, while Venom uses his claws, tendrils to fight. A quick side note is that the handheld version of this game is just a side-scrolling beat-em-up. Very familiar. This game received mostly positive reviews, with the console version of the game sitting around the mid-70s on Metacritic, and the game has to have been a commercial success as it received a prequel 2 years later that we'll get into. I lied. It's 1 year later because in 2006 we got Spider-Man: Battle for New York, released November 14th. Like I said, this is the prequel to the 2005's Ultimate Spider-Man game, this one being released on the Game Boy Advance and the Nintendo DS. This game was developed by Toros Games and published by Activision. In this game, Norman Osborn finds out Spider-Man's identity and how he got his powers and attempts to make his own formula to get a better result. So he makes his own Oz formula, but instead makes himself the Green Goblin, but thinks his formula was a success and starts giving it to other people, making a Goblin army. Spider-Man takes that army and eventually Norman down himself. This one, we're back to the roots of just a side-scrolling platformer beat-em-up where you play as both Spider-Man and Green Goblin. I think this is the first game where you're able to really play as Green Goblin. That's not post-game content, like in the movie tie-in ones. As Spider-Man, you fight goblins, save civilians, and play some mini-games. Then as Goblin, you just destroy targets and fight S.H.I.E.L.D. agents. This game had mediocre reviews, Metacritic having the DS version with mixed to average reviews and sitting at a score of 68, so close. But the Game Boy Advance version doing worse, sitting at a 41 with generally unfavorable reviews. Also in 2006, we had Marvel Ultimate Alliance, released October 24th, 2006, to the PlayStation 2 and 3, the Xbox and Xbox 360, then later ported to the PSP and the Wii. And then a different version was made for the Game Boy Advance, and even later the Xbox 360 version was ported to Windows, Xbox One, and PS4. This game was developed by Raven Software and published by Activision. This is a game where heroes of the Marvel Universe must join forces to defeat Doctor Doom and his Masters of Evil, and foil their plans for global domination. In a third-person team game where the player makes a team of 4 from the 22 playable characters, each having their own attacks and moves as they travel through the stages fighting enemies and solving simple puzzles. With one of the playable characters obviously being Spider-Man, he is also the hero center shot in the cover. The console version received very high reviews, with reviewers praising how well the game did at representing the Marvel Universe and many of its characters. Game did well enough to kickstart a franchise with more games that'll be brought up later. Now for the year 2007, we have a pair of Spider-Man games, starting off with Spider-Man 3, the final movie tie-in game for the Raimi movies. This game was released May 4th, 2007. Released to the PS3 and 2, the PSP, Xbox 360, Windows, Wii, DS, and Game Boy Advance. Treyarch was the developer for the newest gen consoles, Beenox for Microsoft, and then Vicarious Visions for the older gen systems. And this game was published by Activision. So, for this game, it starts with Spider-Man just fighting different warring gangs. Then while hanging out with MJ, he gets the alien symbiote. Harry Osborn then uses his dad's old tech to become the new Goblin, and Flint Marko escapes prison, falls into an experiment, and becomes Sandman. Spider-Man then tracks down a new enemy, the Lizard, who has turned other people into lizardlings. And while Peter defeats him, the Lizard manages to escape. Once exiting the sewers, Spider-Man is attacked by Harry, who he beats and takes to the hospital himself. We see the Mad Bomber attack and kidnap J. Jonah Jameson. Spider-Man saves Jameson, but the bomber gets away. We then see Mac Gargan, who wanted his tail removed so he could have a normal life, instead get put under mind control and free the Rhino from prison. But Spider-Man gets Gargan, and with the help of another scientist, he's able to free Mac. Interesting note that these tie-in movie games, Scorpion's not in the movies, but he's in 2 of these games and is honestly treated as a more sympathetic villain than a lot of other iterations of him. But then at home, the symbiote finally activates, giving Peter the black suit. Spider-Man then goes and fights Sandman, discovering his weakness to water, and defeats him. Then Peter discovers Eddie Brock, another bugle photographer, hired an imposter to pose as Spider-Man robbing a bank so he could take and sell pictures of the incident. Peter then exposes Brock's lie, humiliating him, causing Brock to swear revenge on both Peter and Spider-Man. We then see Spider-Man defeat the Lizard and return him to his human form, even though Kraven the Hunter was hunting him. Then Kingpin unites all the gangs from the previously mentioned gang war against Spider-Man. This causes Spider-Man to confront Kingpin and throw him out a window, seemingly killing him. This, plus Peter just being more aggressive to his loved ones, causes Spider-Man to realize the symbiote is influencing him. So Peter takes off the symbiote at a church, where Eddie Brock is. So the symbiote, sensing Brock's anger, bonds to him. We then see Dr. Connors and Spider-Man curing the Lizardings. Then Venom forces Sandman to join him, and they capture MJ and draw out Spider-Man. Then Harry rejoins the fight, this time to help Peter. And Harry defeats Sandman and saves MJ, but is killed by Venom. Peter then defeats Venom with sonic vibrations, and Brock dies a brutal death. The game ends with Peter and MJ still together, Sandman reunited with his daughter, and Peter choosing to continue being Spider-Man. Some notable differences, but honestly, still relatively similar and in line with the actual movie storyline. This game is an open-world game, allowing you to choose which missions you want to complete, with different storylines going on at once. Once enough missions from each storyline are completed, it allows the main story missions to be unlocked, with there also being fun side missions like races, bomb disarmings, and street crimes. This has the typical web-swinging, wall-crawling, punch and kick combos, and when you have the black suit, a rage mechanic allows you to deal extra damage. There's an upgrade system in this game, allowing for stronger attacks and new combos. You also get to play as New Goblin in this game, where you can glide around, swing attack, and throw pumpkin bombs. As always, the handheld versions for this game are just side-scrolling beat-em-ups, but this game is also famous for one specific QuickTime failed event.
Help! Please! Someone! I'm going to die!
Somehow the highest reviewed version of this game was the DS version, which got a 79 on Metacritic, with the console versions of the game sitting in the high 50s to low 60s. Game was apparently criticized for having tons of glitches. Then, the other game in 2007 was October 7th's Spider-Man, Friend or Foe, released to the PlayStation 2, Xbox 360, the Wii, DS, PSP, and Windows. This game was developed by Next Level Games for the console, Beenox for Windows, and Artificial Mind and Movement for the handhelds, and of course was published by Activision. This game starts with Spider-Man and New Goblin fighting and beating Venom, Sandman, Doc Ock, and Green Goblin, but are then attacked by symbiotes, and everyone but Spider-Man are teleported away, and Spider-Man is rescued by S.H.I.E.L.D. Nick Fury explains that the meteorite that gave Venom his symbiote was broken into multiple pieces and scattered across the world, with one piece being used by someone to make those symbiote creatures called Phantoms. Spider-Man then fights some of the previous villains we saw in the game, who were mind-controlled by the Phantoms, and after freeing them of mind control, they join Spider-Man, as Spider-Man collects multiple shards from the meteorite. It's then revealed Mysterio is the one who created the Phantoms. Mysterio steals more of Spider-Man's shards, so Spider-Man breaks his last shard to reobtain the black suit and beat Mysterio and all his Phantoms. Spider-Man goes back to S.H.I.E.L.D., gets the black suit removed, and gives the shards to Fury. Fury says all of Peter Parker's student loans have been paid off as a thank you, and Spider-Man leaves. The game ends with Nick Fury examining the shards, telling S.H.I.E.L.D. workers to start up Project Carnage. Quick side note for the story, the meteor that brought the Venom symbiote, being super powerful, creating other symbiotes kind of with it. Sound familiar? Maybe a little inspiration from this one. We'll get into that game way later. But this game is a 3D beat-em-up platformer where you play as Spider-Man with a sidekick. Go around the stage, which is very linear and has some basic puzzles. You fight Phantoms leading to a final boss for the stage. These sidekicks include, in all versions of the game, Black Cat, Green Goblin, Doc Ock, Iron Fist, Rhino, Sandman, Venom, New Goblin, and Blade. Then characters you can play in all versions except the PSP being Scorpion, Lizard, Prowler. And then not in the PSP or PlayStation 2, you have Silver Sable. And then there's the PSP exclusive characters, Electro and Carnage. Here's a chart to maybe help understand what is in which game. This game was actually teased in the Spider-Man 3 video game instruction booklet. The teaser stated that this game would be a new twist on the legend, a new take on the movies. I actually couldn't find a picture proving that it's in here, but I'm just going to trust my sources. This, plus New Goblin's inclusion, makes it seem like this game is supposed to take place in the same world as the movies, although there are some major differences. Besides the game engine, Venom is more bulky, Brock is still alive, among new inclusions of never-before-seen characters. The game received pretty mediocre reviews, with its score sitting in the 50s and 60s, with the criticism that the game becomes very repetitive and boring over time. Now, 2008, we have one single game, Spider-Man Web of Shadows. This is the first game I've actually played, and I do have a video up on this channel. This game was released October 21st, 2008. It was released to the Wii, Xbox 360, PlayStation 2 and 3, Windows, Nintendo DS, and the PSP. This game was developed by Shaba and Treyarch for the console, Aspyr for Windows, Griptonite Games for the DS, and Amaze Entertainment for the PlayStation 2 and PSP, all published by Activision. The game starts with Spider-Man fighting Venom and getting the black suit during the fight and defeating Venom, but Venom still escapes. Peter then takes on a gang war with the help of Luke Cage. It turns out the gang war had been orchestrated by Kingpin. While taking on the Kingpin's army with Black Cat, Peter, with the help of Wolverine, discovers Venom has been abducting and infusing people with part of his symbiote, causing a complete quarantine of New York, with S.H.I.E.L.D., led by Black Widow, taking over the city. Spider-Man fights off the infestation of symbiotes and has the final decision of destroying the symbiote-killing bomb or letting it go off. This decision isn't one you make exactly. It's decided by the previous decisions you made from the game up to this point, black suit or red suit decisions. Then you fight Venom and either kill him yourself or let him sacrifice himself. The game then has 4 endings depending on your choices through the game. One where you save the city and end up with MJ, save the city but end up alone, take over the city as King of the Symbiotes with Black Cat, or King of New York and Symbiotes by yourself. The game is an open world, decision-based game. This game features great web slinging in my opinion. Combat is separated into ground, wall, and air combat with a skill tree to level up each phase of combat. There's many boss fights in this game, and some bosses you fight twice. Once regular and once with a symbiote, like Electro, Vulture, and even Wolverine. Quick side note, the PSP, DS, and PS2 versions of this game were a side-scrolling beat-em-up, drastically different from their mainline console counterparts. Just as another side note, the Peter voice acting in this game is my least favorite I've ever heard. Although I haven't heard every performance of the character, but like...
Where's Cage and his search party? The civilian volunteers! Pretty redhead, armed and aghast! You are no help!
Hold that APC! We got vehicles inbound!
MJ!
Come on. This game received relatively positive reviews, although it seems to have only grown in popularity as time has gone on. The game was praised for its story, combat, and boss fights, but was criticized for its graphics and sound. If you want to hear my full opinion on the game, as well as a more in-depth look at the story, go ahead and check out my video on it. It should be linked somewhere. Now, we swing into the year 2009, with 3 games with Spider-Man appearing in them. Starting off with Spider-Man Toxic City, released July 29th, 2009. This was released to the BlackBerry and Windows phones. This is the first purely mobile Spider-Man game. This game was developed and published by Gameloft. In this game, Spider-Man sees a lot of police commotion and then encounters Shocker. After beating him, Shocker tells Spider-Man all the commotion is because of something else, not him. But Spider-Man still doesn't know what's causing it. Next, Spider-Man runs into and beats the Rhino. Then, Peter arrives at school, but due to crime fighting, he missed his date with MJ the night before, and she gives him the silent treatment at school. Peter then sees goblinites, goblin-like creatures, and discovers the commotion from last night was that the Green Goblin had taken hostages and were turning them into goblinites. Peter takes on the goblinites and eventually Green Goblin, with Green Goblin saying the goblinites are the next step in human evolution, but Spider-Man calls them subhuman and not superhuman. Then Spider-Man defeats Green Goblin, who manages to escape, and the game ends. We have touchscreen gameplay with a wheel for movement. You drag your finger on it to move, then a punch button and a web button. Simple side-scrolling beat-em-up gameplay, more like the games of the past, instead of the now increasingly common open-world 3D games that we've been getting. This game received relatively mediocre reviews, with Pocket Gamer giving it a 4 out of 10. Praising the graphics and fluid animation, but said the game was a repetitive button masher and the graphics didn't do enough to make up for that fact. Also in 2009, we had Marvel Ultimate Alliance 2, released September 15th, 3 years after the first one. This was released to the PlayStation 3, Xbox 360, Wii, PlayStation 2, DS, PSP, and then in 2016 it was ported to the PS4, Xbox One, and Windows. This game was developed by Vicarious Visions for the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 versions, InSpace for the PlayStation 2, Wii, and DS versions, Savage Entertainment for the PSP, and then Zone Mode for the 2016 ports, all of it being published by Activision. Just like the first game, you control teams of 4 Marvel characters, each with their own movesets, fighting enemies and solving puzzles in each stage. This game is set during Marvel's Civil War and follows that storyline. Of course, one of the playable characters, and is actually center frame in this game's cover art, is Spider-Man. This game was praised for its story unlockables and fun action-packed combat, was criticized for being stripped of some RPG elements from the first game, and inconsistent voice acting. I actually have a Wii Vault video up on this game, so if you really want to get in depth about this game, this was one that I loved from my childhood, please check that video out. Then, on October 20th, 2009, we got Marvel Superhero Squad, released to the PlayStation 2, PSP, Wii, and DS. It was developed by Blue Tongue Entertainment for the Wii, Halfbrick for the DS, and Mass Media for both PlayStation versions, and published by THQ. This game was a third-person and 3D beat-em-up and puzzle-solving game where you play through stages as different heroes from the TV show Marvel Superhero Squad as you take on Doctor Doom and MODOK's forces, with Spider-Man obviously being one of the playable characters. This game received mostly mediocre reviews, except for the Wii, which got pretty negative reviews, with the other versions clearing the 50% mark on Metacritic, and Wii just falling short of it at 49%. Also, I couldn't find a release date for this game, so I'm going to mention it here. Stark Tower Defense, that was made for Marvel Superhero Squad. This was your typical tower defense game with different hero-themed turrets protecting Stark Tower from Doctor Doom's forces, with Spider-Man being one of the turrets as he shoots his goo at the enemies and slows them down. Besides like Balloon Tower Defense 3, I think this is the tower defense game I played the most as a kid. Cannot find a way to play it now, and it pisses me off. But we move on. And we move on to maybe the biggest year for Spider-Man games in terms of quantity that he's appeared in, because in 2010, he appears in 4 different games. Starting off with Spider-Man Shattered Dimensions, released September 7th. This was released to the PlayStation 3, Xbox 360, Wii, DS, and Windows. This game was developed by Beenox for the consoles and Windows, and Kryptonite Games for the DS, published by Activision. In this game, Mysterio attempts to steal a magical tablet, but is stopped by the Amazing Spider-Man, who accidentally breaks the tablet and sends different pieces into 4 total dimensions, including Amazing Spider-Man's dimension. Then, Madam Web notifies 4 Spider-Man, the Amazing Spider-Man from the beginning, Ultimate Spider-Man, which is Peter with the symbiote suit, Spider-Man Noir, a 1920s to 30s Peter Parker, and Spider-Man 2099, Miguel O'Hara, the Spider-Man of the future. All the Spider-Man work together to gather the tablet pieces in their dimensions, which they get from fighting through the game stage, with each stage having a specific boss, where you usually fight them once normally and then once more when they power up with a piece of the tablet. Then, all the Spider-Man get the tablet together, but Mysterio captures Madam Web and uses her to get the full tablet and becomes a multi-dimensional, superpowered villain. But all Spider-Man come together to beat him and return to their worlds, with the game ending with a Spider-Ham post-credit scene. The whole game is playing through a stage as one of the 4 Spider-Men, fighting the boss twice and getting the shard. Each Spider-Man's world has their own art style, which helps each Spider-Man feel unique, as while there are some attack differences, combat feels the same for 3 of the Spider-Man, with the exception being Spider-Man Noir, that is a stealth-based takedown combat. Only other gameplay difference of note is that Spider-Man 2099 has some diving sections of the game. The villains in this game are Kraven, Hammerhead, Hobgoblin, Electro, Sandman, Vulture, Scorpion, Deadpool. Side note, not the best Deadpool I've seen. Juggernaut, Green Goblin, Doc Ock, Carnage, and then finally, Mysterio. I think this is the first game you get to control multiple Spider-Man in one game, with this game allowing you to control 4. This is the first game to be mainly developed by Beenox, replacing Treyarch via Activision. The DS version of this is another side-scrolling game, the default for Spider-Man games. The game sits in the 70s on Metacritic, with the game being praised for its concept, fun gameplay, and story, but is criticized for not pushing the boundary on anything and being hurt by Arkham Asylum coming out, as multiple critics cited Asylum being better than Shattered Dimensions in their review. Don't know why they felt the need to relate the two, but they did. The game did well enough for a sequel that came out only 1 year later, that we'll get into. This is another game I have a full video on this channel about, so check that out if you're more curious about the game. I highly recommend checking this out. Then on September 1st, 2010, we got Ultimate Spider-Man Total Mayhem, released to iOS and Android, developed and published by Gameloft. This is another mobile game exclusive. We see Spider-Manning, defeating the Sandman and then fighting the Rhino, who gets away. Then a fire allows all supervillains and even more symbiotes to escape prison, and Spider-Man must round them back up. Spider-Man then fights multiple villains: Electro, Green Goblin, Rhino, even Venom a couple times. But after defeating Green Goblin, we see Dr. Connors make an antidote to cure people of symbiotes that have spread through the city, and the game ends. Just a simple beat-em-up game on your phone with touchscreen controls, with on-screen buttons allowing you to move and fight. Graphics are pretty simple given the device they're on. This game has a Metacritic score of 85%, making it one of the highest-rated Spider-Man games, leading it to having over 20 million downloads. Gamers praise for being one of the best action games out in app stores with good graphics. Then, for 2010, on November 16th, we got another Marvel Superhero Squad game. This time, Marvel Superhero Squad The Infinity Gauntlet, released to the PlayStation 3, Xbox 360, Wii, DS, and 3DS, developed by Kryptonite Games and published by THQ. This is once again a 3D puzzle-solving action game where you play as chibi versions of different Marvel heroes as you take on the forces of evil, with Spider-Man being one of those heroes you can be. This is now the third Marvel Superhero Squad game I've mentioned in this video so far, and this game received mediocre reviews. Then, for the final game of 2010, the last of the four, on December 8th, we got Marvel Pinball. This was released on the PlayStation 3, Xbox 360, 3DS, Wii U, PC, Vita, Android, and iOS. This was developed by Zen Studios and published by Zen Studios, Microsoft Studios, and Sony Computer Entertainment. This is the first game with one developer and multiple publishers. Usually it's the other way around. But it's just a pinball, nothing unique to it. Marvel-themed pinball designs you could choose from, including Spider-Man. And it's one of the highest rated games I've talked about, with this game sitting in the high 80s on Metacritic. Then, in 2011, we have a trio of games with Spider-Man in it, starting off with April 29th's Marvel Superhero Squad Online for Windows and Mac OS. This was developed by Gazillion Entertainment and published by Marvel. The game was a massive multiplayer online where you can play as different Marvel heroes and do typical MMO shenanigans, questing, microtransactioning, and sucking, as this game lasted 6 years before shutting down in 2017, and the studio that made it having to close its doors. I remember playing this game a little bit when it had came out, did not play it for long. Then we got the sequel to Spider-Man Shattered Dimensions, where we have Spider-Man Edge of Time, released October 4th, 2011. Released to the PlayStation 3, Xbox 360, Wii, DS, and 3DS. This was developed by Beenox for the consoles and Other Ocean Interactive for DS. This game was published by Activision. In 2099, we see scientists from Alchemax, Walker Sloan, make a time portal, but before Miguel O'Hara, the Spider-Man from 2099, can stop him, he goes back in time, founds Alchemax in the 70s, changing a lot of things. Then, in 2011, he starts to make a time portal again so he can go back and forth between his time and modern day, and sends Anti-Venom out to fight Spider-Man. Miguel O'Hara has a mind link he established in Shattered Dimensions with Peter Parker and tries to warn him, but due to Anti-Venom putting people in harm's way, he goes to fight him anyways. There, in the portal room, we see Sloan, Doc Ock, who I think is just a normal scientist with helping arms, and Anti-Venom. Anti-Venom defeats Peter, but Miguel jumps through the portal, defeats Anti-Venom, pulling Spider-Man into the future to heal. And Miguel pushes Anti-Venom, Sloan, and Doc Ock into the portal, fusing into one atrocity. This causes the portal to break, stranding Peter and Miguel in each other's time, and they have to fix it on both ends. While Peter works to fix it in the future, he fights a Black Cat clone, and discovers he's the CEO of Alchemax, who wants to harness the power of the time portal to rewrite history. But the Spider-Man fix the portal and return to their own time, and Peter defeats Atrocity and Miguel beats Evil Peter, and they destroy the portal, restoring the timeline to what it was and ending the game. This is a action-packed game where you play as 2 different Spider-Men and have skill trees to upgrade them as you fight through waves of enemies. And this whole game takes place in one building. The same building in 2 different time periods. This limits the web swinging immensely, and I'm just going to leave it at that. One side note is that the voice actors for Amazing Spider-Man and 2099 were both in Shattered Dimensions, but voicing different Spider-Mans. As Amazing Spider-Man in this was Josh Keaton, but was Neil Patrick Harris in Dimensions. And Keaton was Ultimate Spider-Man. And the Miguel in this game is Christopher Daniel Barnes, who was Spider-Man Noir in Dimensions, and Dan Gilvezan was 2099 in Dimensions. Now I have a video out on this game as well if you want my in-depth thoughts on the game, so check that out. But as for the reception, Metacritic has this game sitting at around 50 to 60, with the story and voice acting being praised, and the repetitive gameplay is what's criticized. Then, for the last of this trio in 2011, on November 15th, we got Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3 for the PlayStation 3, Xbox 360, Vita, and then was later ported to the PlayStation 4 in 2016 and Windows and Xbox One in 2017. This game was developed by Capcom and Aiding and published by Capcom. This is a fighting game featuring Capcom and Marvel characters, obviously with Spider-Man as a playable character, as he's been in all 3 of the Marvel vs. Capcom games so far. The game was received very well with a score of about an 80 on Metacritic, getting a sequel 7 years later, which we'll get into. Now it's 2012, where we got, again, 3 Spider-Man video games. Only one main one, though. But the first game we have is Marvel Avengers Alliance, released March 12th. This was for iOS, Android, Windows, Facebook, and Play.com. This was developed by Offbeat Creations and was published by Playdom for its first 2 years, then Disney Interactive after that. It's a turn-based fighting game where you use 3 Marvel characters to fight, either AI or other players, with one of the available Marvel characters being Spider-Man. Then a Facebook-only version was made called Marvel Avengers Alliance Tactics. It's the same game with a 3D map that was released June 14th. The game stayed around for 4 years as Disney shut down the game in 2016. Next, in 2012, we finally got another movie tie-in game with The Amazing Spider-Man, released June 26, 2012, about a week before the movie was released. This one came out on PlayStation 3, Xbox 360, Wii, Wii U, 3DS, DS, Vita, Windows, iOS, Android, and Windows Phone. Any system they could put it on, it was on. It was developed by Beenox for most systems, Other Ocean Interactive for the DS, and Gameloft for Android and iOS. All of this published by Activision. This game takes place months after the events of the movie. Interesting choice considering it came out before the movie. But we see Peter and Gwen investigating Oscorp after rumors they are still doing cross-species experiments, like what Dr. Connors was doing. There they see they continue the experiments, creating different cross-species creatures that escape, and while they escape, they give Gwen and Oscorp director Alistair Smith, been a minute since we've seen him, a deadly virus. Spider-Man takes the infected to get quarantined and then go after the cross-species. Spider-Man beats a cross-species hunting robot, then breaks out Dr. Connors from prison to help create a cure for the disease. Then Spider-Man fights and beats a cross-species, which is the Rhino in this game, which is more like how people think of Rhino than what the sequel movie had. Peter then retrieves stuff from a lab for Connors to use, and then from Vermin, another cross-species creature you fight in the game. Connors makes an antidote, and Spider-Man brings it to Oscorp. But when Smith takes it, he loses the use of his legs and orders robots to attack Spider-Man, who flees. Then Connors realizes Spider-Man is a cross-species that still has his humanity, so Connors makes a new antidote, and Spider-Man takes the new antidote to Oscorp, fighting robots and a Scorpion cross-species, this game Scorpion, and gives the antidote to Gwen, who is cured and is fine. Her legs still work. Smith got hoed on this one. Spider-Man then stops a bank robbery orchestrated by Black Cat, and then Smith is fired from Oscorp and discovers Spider-Man's secret identity. Always a good thing. So Smith first captures Dr. Connors, who was working on replicating the cure for the disease that has spread throughout the city. And then Smith captures Spider-Man and injects him with nanobites, stripping him of his powers, and begins to die. Dr. Connors becomes a lizard on purpose to try and fight Smith, and Peter reunites with Gwen. And Gwen uses an AED on Peter as he's dying, and the electricity from the AED destroys the nanobites, saving his life and allowing him to be Spider-Man again. So, Spider-Man and Lizard take down Smith, and then Lizard loses himself and runs off, and Gwen reprograms a Oscorp robot to distribute the antidote throughout the city. Spider-Man then defeats the Lizard and turns him back into Dr. Connors, who willingly goes back to prison. With the city being saved, Gwen and Peter relax. Then, in the post-credits, we see Smith's legs working, but he starts to turn into a cross-species. This is another open-world Spider-Man game where the missions are linear, but there are side objectives you can complete in between them. Combat is more based on Arkham Asylum, with counterattacks being added, the first Spider game to make that a major part of the combat. Game does have DLC with a Rhino DLC with new missions. I think this is the first game to have a full-fledged DLC, making sense as DLC increasingly becomes popular during this time. The handheld versions of this game follow the same story and use the same voice cast. The open world is gone and the players just play through each stage one after another. Also, I think this is the first game with Gwen Stacy, at least in a prominent role. This game received pretty okay reviews, with the console versions peaking at 70% on Metacritic, with the Wii and DS versions falling to the 50s. The consensus being this game doesn't necessarily exceed in any category, but is still fun to play and doesn't have any detrimental flaws. Then, finally for 2012, on October 30th, we got Avengers: Battle for Earth, released only to the Xbox 360 and Wii. Interesting pairing of systems to be exclusive to. This was developed by Ubisoft Quebec and published by Ubisoft. Ubisoft? Ubisoft. The Skrulls are invading, and you play as Marvel characters to fight them back. Sometimes the Skrulls look and act like other Marvel heroes. It's an arena-style fighting game, with one of the playable characters being Spider-Man. The game received pretty mediocre reviews, with the Wii U at a 50 and Xbox 360 at a 62 on Metacritic, with the game being called bare bones, but as advertised. We get back-to-back years with 3 games of Spider-Man in them, but none of these ones are main Spider-Man games. 2013 starts off with Marvel Heroes, coming out on June 14th. This was released on Windows and OS, with Xbox One and PS4 later getting ports. This was developed by Gazillion Entertainment and Secret Identity Studios, published by Gazillion Entertainment as well. This game is a MMORPG that allows you to play as different Marvel superheroes as you fight different Marvel villains and villainous groups, including Doctor Doom. And guess what? One of the characters you can play as is Spider-Man. Shocking. This game started out having pretty mediocre reviews, with the game getting reviews in the 50s, but with later updates, it was able to raise itself all the way to the 80s. Quite the improvement. Next, in 2013, on October 3rd, we got Marvel Puzzle Quest. First for iOS and Android, then later Windows, PS3 and 4, Xbox 360 and 1, and the Kindle. Developed by Demiurge Studios and Broken Circle Studios, and WayForward Technologies for the HD ports. It was published by D3 Go and 505 Games. This is your typical gym breaker mobile game, and I'm sure there's more to it, but that's all that matters for this video. Also, Spider-Man is in there. And IGN gave it a 9.1 for what it's worth. Then, for the final game of 2013, we did get, on October 22nd, Lego Marvel Superheroes. This was released to Windows, Mac, PlayStation 3 and 4, Wii U, Xbox 360, and 1, and later ported to the Switch and a version for iOS, Android, DS, 3DS, and Vita. This was developed by Traveler's Tales and published by Warner Bros. Interactive Entertainment. This is a game where Marvel heroes in Lego form take on Doctor Doom, Loki, and other villains they recruited. One of the Marvel characters you can play as is Lego Spider-Man. All versions of the game sit around 80% on Metacritic, typical LEGO game fun and charm. It's now 2014, and we have 4 Spider-Man appearances in this one, starting off with the dedicated game on April 17th, The Amazing Spider-Man 2, the sequel game to the one we saw earlier, and the tie-in to the movie. This was released to Android, iOS, Windows, PlayStation 3 and 4, Xbox 360 and 1, Wii U, and 3DS. This was developed by Beenox, and it was published by Activision, except for in Japan, where it was published by Square Enix. Game starts with Spider-Man looking for the man who killed Uncle Ben, but that killer was then killed by the Carnage Killer. Spider-Man then stops a gang's attack on Oscorp, fighting the Shocker and saving Max Dillon, Oscorp electrical engineer. Then Harry Osborn and Wilson Fisk fund an anti-crime task force to fight crime, including masked vigilantes like Spider-Man. Then, after learning from Kraven, Spider-Man tracks down the Carnage killer, Cletus Cassidy, capturing and leading to his arrest, where in prison he is experimented with a red substance codenamed Venom. Then a gang war erupts with a Kingpin emerging and seizing all power. Kingpin hires Black Cat to kill Spider-Man, but she refuses, tells Spider-Man Wilson Fisk is the Kingpin, and then goes into hiding. Then Spider-Man goes as Peter to talk with his friend Harry about Fisk, but Peter sees how sick his friend is, and Harry wants Spider-Man's blood to make a cure, but Peter refuses, angering Harry, but he starts to look for a cure elsewhere. Spider-Man is then attacked by Kraven, and then Peter goes after Kingpin. But then Electro, Max Dillon we saw earlier after a freak accident became superpowered, causes a blackout and a fight with Spider-Man that results in Electro's death. Then Harry injects a serum, turning him into Green Goblin, and Spider-Man fights him, and Goblin is killed when he's impaled by his own glider. Seems a little familiar. Then Cletus turns into Carnage in prison after his experiments, and Spider-Man fights and defeats him, with Cletus begging to be killed, but Spider-Man refuses, and Cletus is imprisoned again, and his symbiote removed. The game ends with Peter deciding to continue being Spider-Man, and Fisk taking over Oscorp and working with the Chameleon, teasing another game that never came. Same gameplay as the previous game, open world, linear story, side quests that pop up, same fighting style. Map was larger and added a subway system to take you to Spider-Man's home in Queens, which is the main hub in the game. This game's flashback of Uncle Ben's death is used in Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse when Miguel talks about canon events. This game received mediocre reviews, with scores on Metacritic sitting at around 50%, with the graphics and glitches being criticized, and people saying this game ultimately feels like a copy and paste of the previous game, possibly causing this to be the nail in the coffin for Spider-Man tie-in games, as there hasn't been a true full tie-in Spider-Man game since. The other reason for that probably being that movie video games as a whole suck. Now, there's these VR experiences for the Tom Holland movies. I'm not really counting those as video games, but here's the mention of them existing right now. That's all I'll say on them. Next up, in 2014, we got on September 10th, Spider-Man Unlimited, released to Android, iOS, and Windows Phone, developed and published by Gameloft. It's just a Temple Run, Subway Surfer type Spider-Man game. Gotta take advantage and copy the trends, don't blame them. Has a 79% score on Metacritic and has its dedicated fan base, but was discontinued in 2019, having a solid and fun 5-year run. Then, on September 18th, 2014, we got Disney Infinity 2.0. This was released on iOS, Android, PlayStation 3 and 4, the Vita, Wii U, Windows, Xbox 360, and One. This was developed by Avalanche Software for console and Heavy Iron Studios for the phone versions, published by Disney Interactive Studios. This was pretty much Disney's Skylanders, where you buy physical figures giving you access to those characters in the game. Now, Disney Infinity came out the year before, but this is when the Marvel expansion was released, allowing you to play as Spider-Man in the game, so that's why I'm talking about it here. The game received mostly positive reviews, with it being in the 70s on Metacritic. Then, for the final game in 2014, we have Marvel Contest of Champions, released December 10th. This was released to iOS and Android and was developed and published by Kabam. This is a fighting game similar to that of Injustice and Mortal Kombat, with 3D characters on a 2D plane, one-on-one combat, with Spider-Man being one of the playable characters. An arcade version of this game, exclusive to Dave & Buster's, was developed by Raw Thrills and was released in 2019. The game has a 76% on Metacritic and has over 100 million downloads on the Play Store. Safe to say, this game was a success. Now, 2015 was a pretty disappointing year, as there's only one game with Spider-Man in it this year, and it's not even a dedicated game. As on April 30th, we got Marvel Future Fight, developed and published by Netmarble Games. Is another Marvel fighting game where you move around on a stage as a chosen Marvel hero in a 3D space fighting enemies and bosses, with on-screen buttons allowing you to move and do different actions and attacks. One of the available characters, Spider-Man. Game has a 79 on Metacritic, over 100 million downloads, and is still around today. So the game itself did pretty well, but just in terms of talking about Spider-Man, really not that interesting. So we move on. Now, I made fun of 2015 for only having one game, but that actually is kind of the norm from here on out. And 2016 is no different. On February 4th, 2016, we got Marvel Avengers Academy, released to iOS, Android, and Fire OS, different Amazon products, developed and published by TinyCo. This was a game where you as the player manage a school for students to hone in their powers and superhero-ness, where you upgrade the school and recruit students, one of which being Spider-Man. This game only lasted 3 years as the game had mixed reviews, with Polygon praising it, saying it was more fun than it had any right to be, but Pocket Gamers saying the game was free-to-play games at their worst. Different opinions, but I guess ultimately the negative ones won out. Then we have one lone game again in 2017. We got Lego Marvel Superheroes 2 on November 14th. This was released to the Nintendo Switch, PS4, Xbox One, Windows, and Mac. Developed by Traveler Tales and published by Warner Bros. Interactive Entertainment. This is a sequel to the 2013 game, this one having Marvel heroes on different eras and dimensions take on Kang the Conqueror and his forces. This game allowing you to play as a Spider-Man we all know, as well as Spider-Man 2099, Spider-Gwen, and Spider-Man Noir. Game sits in the 70s on Metacritic and was nominated for Best Family Game at many different video game awards. Now, 2018, we do get 2 Spider-Man appearances this year, starting off with Marvel Strike Force, released on iOS and Android. Developed and published by Fox Next from 2018 to 2020, and then it was developed and published by Scopely from 2020 till now. This is a turn-based game where Marvel heroes fight back against Ultimate's invasion of Earth, Spider-Man being a playable hero in this game. And for the reception of this game, I mean, it's still around today, so it has to be somewhat good, I'm assuming. But moving on to the next one, this is a real minor inclusion. Then the big one, September 7th, Marvel's Spider-Man. Originally just released to the PlayStation 4, later ported to the PlayStation 5 and Windows. This was developed by Insomniac Games and published by Sony Interactive Entertainment. The tutorial for this game starts off with Spider-Man taking down Wilson Fisk, aka the Kingpin. Then a group called the Inner Demon starts taking over some of Kingpin's assets and searches for something called the Devil's Breath. With the help of Officer Jefferson Davis, Spider-Man thwarts a demon's attack. Officer Davis is praised for his work at a re-election campaign for Mayor Osborn, but there's an Inner Demon's attack at the ceremony and Officer Davis is killed. At the incident, Peter sees Martin Lee, a philanthropist he knows who runs Feast where Aunt May works at, turns into the demon's leader, Mr. Negative, but he gets away. Osborn then calls in Silver Sable and Saber International to replace the police, and then Peter befriends Officer Davis' son, Miles Morales, and encourages him to volunteer at Feast. We then see Peter with Dr. Otto Octavius as they attempt to progress prosthetic limbs, but Osborn withdraws his funding, hoping he'll start working at Oscorp, but Otto refuses. It's then revealed that Devil's Breath is a deadly virus accidentally made by Oscorp when they are attempting to make a cure for genetic diseases. Lee gets a sample of Devil's Breath and threatens Osborn with it, but is stopped by Spider-Man, and the Devil's Breath is secured. We then see Dr. Octavius begin to obsess with his robo-limb technology and anger towards Osborn, creating tentacle arms, and reveals to Peter that he has a disease that will leave him immobile, but these tentacles will allow him to keep working. Peter warns him about what he's doing, and he might be going down a bad path. Later, Spider-Man learns that Martin Lee, Electro, Vulture, Rhino, and Scorpion have all escaped prison, and they jump him, beat him, and present him to Dr. Octavius, who is now Dr. Octopus or Doc Ock. Doc Ock then releases Devil's Breath into New York City, causing a mass outbreak, as many become infected, including Aunt May, and Osborn declares martial law and blames Spider-Man for the outbreak, causing him to now be a fugitive. Spider-Man then defeats Rhino, Electro, Vulture, and Scorpion. We then learn Devil's Breath was intended to be a cure for Osborn's terminally ill son and MJ and Peter's friend Harry Osborn, and Lee was a test subject for the cure, which caused him to develop his powers, but accidentally killed his parents with them and created his hatred for Osborn. MJ then discovers that there is a cure for Devil's Breath, and Lee has it, so Spider-Man finds Lee, gets the cure, but is attacked and defeated by Doc Ock, who escapes with the antidote. After that, we see Miles get bitten by a genetically modified spider from Oscorp. Spider-Man then builds an armored suit and takes on Doc Ock, who reveals he knows Peter is Spider-Man, and Spider-Man defeats him, leading to Doc Ock's arrest. And then Peter has to make a choice. Use the limited amount of the antidote to cure Aunt May, or use it to make more and cure the masses. Before making the decision, he sees May, who reveals she knows he's Spider-Man, and says how proud she is. Peter decides he has to cure the masses, and Aunt May dies. Not gonna lie, just reading this right now, I am tearing up. This hit. The game ends with Peter and MJ rekindling their relationship, Miles revealing he has spider powers, and Norman Osborn having his son in a tank with something in it. Something goopy. What do we know that's goopy in the Spider-Man world? But this game is an open-world Spider-Man game with different minor plots going on at the same time as the main plot. And you could choose what missions to do when you want, but each plot line having linear mission path allowing for the story to build on top of itself. This game is probably the best web swinging ever upon release, surpassing Spider-Man 2, as well as good combat. Typical Spider-Man moves and Spider-Sense counter mechanic, with this game having the most web shooters we've ever seen in any Spider-Man game, with different devices for normal combat and stealth combat. Stealth combat in this game allows you to take down enemies in one move, allowing you to either clear out an area with no real combat or lessen the amount of enemies you'll have to fight. This is the first major Spider-Man game to not be made by Activision, as Sony decided to give the rights to Insomniac to make a larger scale Spider-Man game. Another interesting note is the change of Peter's character model, which has been discussed a lot online, and there's probably full videos on the topic. All I'll say is, I prefer the original model. This seemed more like a Spider-Man that's been doing this for years, which Insomniac Spider-Man has. The game did consist of a DLC which involved Spider-Man fighting a new wave of crime in the city, most notably fighting mob boss Hammerhead. This game is one of the best Spider-Man games. That's my opinion and the consensus opinion, with the game being almost a 90 on Metacritic, being nominated for Game of the Year by multiple publications, and even winning Game of the Year by Wired. I'll say I think this was the best Spider-Man game ever when it was released, and this game did well enough to garner a sequel we'll get into later. Then, in 2019, we go back to just one game with Spider-Man in it, as on July 19th, 2019, we got Marvel Ultimate Alliance 3, The Black Order, released exclusively to the Nintendo Switch, developed by Team Ninja and published by Nintendo. This is the newest installment in the Marvel Ultimate Alliance series, the same four heroes at one time, puzzle-solving and combat stage-based game, with Spider-Man once again being a playable character. This game has a completely different team behind this one, as Activision's license to make any Marvel game expired in 2016, allowing for Nintendo to scoop up the Ultimate Alliance title and make the newest one a console exclusive. Of all the companies that I would have picked to Ultimate Alliance to become an exclusive to, Nintendo would have been ranking near the bottom. Ultimate Alliance was a little edgier than I would think Nintendo, but here we are. But the game sits at a 73 on Metacritic, the consensus being it doesn't do anything groundbreaking, but it's generally a good time with some down moments. Then for the year 2020, we have one solo Spider-Man game. This one's a bit different, as on November 12th, 2020, we got Marvel's Spider-Man, Miles Morales. Originally released to the PS4 and 5, but was later ported to Windows as well. It was developed by Insomniac Games and published by Sony Interactive Entertainment. Miles has been Peter's partner for about a year now and is getting good with his powers. But Peter leaves on a trip with MJ Smycaria. I definitely said that wrong. But this leaves Miles as the only Spider-Man in town for a while. We see Miles investigating a break-in at Roxxon as their new power source is being stolen by a new high-tech criminal group, the Underground. But we see Miles' friend Genki create an app to call for help from Spider-Man. We then meet Finn, an old friend of Miles, who's now back in his life. If I remember correctly, there was a thing between Miles and Finn. Miles' Uncle Aaron uses the Spider-Man app and reveals he knows Miles is Spider-Man. Miles then sees Roxxon and the Underground have a fight that escalates and bleeds over into an attack during his mother Rio Morales' campaign event. He attempts to stop the Underground from getting the new energy source, Nuform, but his Venom ability accidentally causes it to explode and destroy a bridge. During this incident, Miles learns that Finn is the Tinkerer, a villain working with the Underground. Miles investigates Finn and learns her brother Rick was the one who created Nuform, but knew it was dangerous and was going to inform the public, but was killed by Roxxon and Krieger, the head of Roxxon. Miles then works with his Uncle Aaron as the Prowler to retrieve a phone with proof of Krieger's crime, but the phone is destroyed in a fight. Miles then listens to Uncle Aaron's advice and uses Finn to get close to the Underground. Miles then learns that Finn has been making the Underground's weapons in exchange for them going after Roxxon. But Miles is outed as Spider-Man, pissing Finn off, and Miles has to flee. When Miles tries to talk to Finn, both are attacked by Roxxon and a power-boosted Rhino, but Miles and Finn escape. Miles then learns that his own uncle has been spying on him for Roxxon, and we learn that Krieger has created a Nuform reactor that will explode in Harlem. Finn gets angry, knocks Miles out, and flees. Genki brings Miles home, and Rio learns that her son is Spider-Man. Miles sets out after Finn, but is captured by his uncle Aaron, who wants to keep Miles safe, especially after the death of Miles' dad, who Aaron was never able to reconcile with. But Miles breaks free and defeats his uncle and says he can't turn his back on people who need him and goes after Finn on top of Roxxon, while Aaron, inspired by his nephew, works with Rio to escort people out of Harlem. Miles can't reason with Finn, fights her, and Miles attempts to absorb the new form that's about to explode. Finn starts to feel remorse for her actions and flies Miles above the city, allowing him to let the new form explode, killing Finn, and Miles falls back to the city, but lives, but is unmasked in front of a couple of citizens who promise to keep quiet and praise him. Game ends with Roxxon being sued to hell, Krieger being arrested, and Aaron turning himself in. Miles gets called the Spider-Man of Harlem, and we see Peter return and praise Miles for everything he's done. Then, in the post-credits, Norman Osborn tells Dr. Carnes to let his son out of his tank, and Miles pays respects to Finn, his fallen friend. This game is mostly the same as the previous Spider-Man game, with the notable difference being Miles' electrical powers that Peter doesn't have. And this doesn't lead to crazy different gameplay, but mostly just different visual differences in the attacks Miles is able to do. This game is the launch title for the PS5, which is a smart move because Spider-Man sells. This game also had a tie-in prequel comic that showcased more of Miles learning how to be Spider-Man. But this is the first main Spider-Man game that allows you to not only play as Miles Morales, but not play as Peter Parker. This is the first Spider-Man game where Peter Parker is not fully playable throughout the whole game like every other Spider-Man game up to this point. This game was a great sequel, scoring mid-80s, only slightly less than the original on Metacritic. Game was also nominated for a bunch of gaming awards and won a couple, mostly centered around the music in the game. Then for 2021, we have two non-Spider-Man games that Spider-Man does appear in, starting off with Marvel Future Revolution, released August 25th. This was released to iOS and Android, developed and published by Netmarble. This is another mobile game, this one apparently based on Secret Wars, with multiple playable Marvel heroes, including Spider-Man. Buttons on screen to fight enemies on the main Earth, Hydra Earth, Asgardian Settled Earth, and more. This has a 78 on Metacritic, but the game was shut down exactly 2 years after launch, so not the best success we've seen in this video. Then the other game for 2021 is Marvel Avengers. Now, it was actually originally released on September 4th, 2020, but Spider-Man wasn't included. Spider-Man's addition to this game came in November 2021, more than a full year after the game originally came out. This was released to the PlayStation 4 and 5, Xbox One, and Xbox Series X and S, Windows, and Google Stadia. Remember Google Stadia? I bought it. Whoops. It was developed by Crystal Dynamics, and it was published by Square Enix from 2020 to 2022, and then Crystal Dynamics did publishing 2022 to 2023. This is a game allowing players to play as different Marvel heroes as they take on AIM. Now, while not originally in the game, Spider-Man was added to the roster, like I had said, and the web swinging was ripped. That's what it looked like. Yep, pretty rough. This game sits in the 60s on Metacritic and was ridiculed when it came out and was a commercial failure and was shut down and delisted just 3 years after its release. Then 2022 is another year with 2 games that Spider-Man appears in, but neither being a mainline game. Starting off with Marvel Snap, released October 18th, 2022 to Android and iOS, developed by Second Dinner and published by Newverse. This is a Marvel card collecting mobile app with Spider-Man making an appearance in the game. This game is a really good 85 on Metacritic and won Best Mobile Game at the Game Awards in 2022. The game is still alive and going strong today. Then, on December 2nd, 2022, we got Marvel's Midnight Suns, released to the PlayStation 4 and 5, Xbox One, and Xbox Series X and S, as well as Windows. Developed by Firaxis Games and published by 2K. This is a tactical role-playing game exploring more of the darker sides of Marvel and allows you to play as different Marvel heroes, including Spider-Man. A pretty well-received game with it sitting in the 80s on Metacritic, but unfortunately it was a commercial flop, so that does suck. And ladies and gentlemen, we have the final game to talk about in this video. On October 20th, 2023, we got Marvel's Spider-Man 2, released to the PlayStation 5, developed by Insomniac, and published by Sony. Game starts with Peter as Miles' new teacher, but Sandman attacks, and they leave to go fight and beat him, costing Peter his job. But when hanging out with MJ, Harry Osborn, Peter's childhood friend, shows back up and offers him a job at a tech startup aiming at bettering the world named Emily May Foundation, after Aunt May for Peter and Harry's late mother, Emily. Later, Peter and Miles oversee a prison transfer of Scorpion and Martin Lee, but they get attacked by hunters led by Kraven, and the Spider-Men fail to save Scorpion and Lee. Peter investigates Kraven and discovers he's hunting down these superpowered villains and has killed Scorpion, Vulture, Shocker, and Electro. Kraven then goes after Black Cat, but Miles helps her escape to Paris. Then we see Peter enjoying Coney Island with Harry and MJ, but the hunters then attack and capture a new, reformed Tombstone. During the attack, Harry is revealed to have a super suit that is keeping him alive from his terminal illness that killed his mother. And Harry learns that Peter is Spider-Man, and Spider-Man learns of Harry's suit that Harry said was made by Dr. Connors. We see Harry with his suit power increasing, and Peter rescue Tombstone. Then we learn that Kraven has captured Dr. Connors thanks to MJ's field investigating. The trio attempt to save Connors, but he turns into the lizard and flees, and Kraven stabs Peter in the stomach. Harry pieces up Kraven, but lets off to help Peter, and Kraven escapes. Harry's exosuit leaves Harry to save Peter's life, giving him a familiar-looking suit. Peter, with his new suit, goes after Kraven to get the antidote to cure Connors, which he retrieves. But Kraven becomes fully interested in the new Peter and notices his reaction to the church bell ringing. Spider-Man then uses the antidote to cure Connors after beating him. Connors tells Peter that what he's wearing is not a suit and is something called a symbiote, an alien, and warns Peter it could be affecting him, and we then immediately see the symbiote go on a rampage against the hunters while Peter is asleep, leading to MJ being terrified of him and Miles being captured by Kraven. Kraven then forces Miles to fight Martin Lee, who instead of killing, like Kraven wanted, he helps Lee escape and directs him towards Peter, who leads him to Kraven, who Peter beats but ends up fighting Miles, and Kraven still lives. After their fight, Miles convinces Peter to get rid of the symbiote, which he does, and they contain the symbiote. Peter then goes to Oscorp to give the symbiote to Dr. Connors, but is instead greeted by Harry, who gets enraged by Peter from keeping his life-saving suit away from him and rejoins with it, being more overtaken by the symbiote and becoming Venom. And he goes on his own rampage, ending in him fighting and killing Kraven. Venom then turns MJ into Scream, who Peter beats and frees. Then Peter and Miles go after Venom, but get overrun by symbiotes, and Peter becomes debilitated and is saved by Martin Lee, who gives Peter some of his powers, causing Peter to become Anti-Venom. Venom then gets the meteorite that the symbiote came down with and begins terraforming the world. Peter distracts Venom, and MJ steals the meteorite, leading to a final showdown at the Emily May Foundation, leading to Peter freeing Harry of the symbiote, causing Harry to go into a coma. The game ends with MJ becoming a podcaster, relatable, Peter retiring from being Spider-Man and continuing Emily May Foundation in honor of Harry, Miles becoming the city's only Spider-Man, Norman Osborn teasing the Goblin Serum and talking with Doc Ock, and the game teasing Cindy Moon, a Spider-Person we'll likely see in a later installment. Gameplay is the same as the previous one, while scaling back the web shooting gadgets, adding special attacks centered around Miles' electrical abilities and Peter's spider arms, and later symbiote abilities. The game allows you to switch back and forth between the two Spider-Men, making this the first game where you play as more than one Spider-Man in the same dimension and point in time. This game also added in flight wings to traversal in the game, allowing you to glide through the city. This and some other tweaks allow you to travel through the city even faster than the previous titles. This game also had a tie-in comic. This game sits at an extremely impressive 90% on Metacritic, which I think makes it the highest rated Spider-Man game ever. This game was nominated for many major awards, including Game of the Year, but ultimately didn't win any. But I will say this game is the sole reason I got a PS5, and it was worth it. This game was amazing. Now, from 1982 to now, in 2024, the Spider-Man video games have gone through a lot of change. Mostly going from 8-bit to stunning HD visuals, simple side-scrolling beat-em-ups to open-world, massive games with an insane feeling of freedom. Stories that are barely there and might need to read the game manual to even get, to complex narratives with true heart. I feel that Spider-Man in games is in the best place it's ever been. The character has found itself in the hands of developers that have the utmost care, understanding, and ability to execute outstanding games. And I can't wait to see what else is in store for the future of this game. Now, while this sounds like a great send-off, I'd actually like to end this video off by looking at different things that appeared in Spider-Man games over the years and how frequently, starting with villains. Note, I'm going off main Spider-Man games, so stuff like Lego Marvel, Marvel Snap, and things like that will not be counted for this. These are main Spider-Man games. Also, every version of a villain is being counted towards the same, so this Tinkerer and this Tinkerer are both Tinkerers, so they're being counted for the same Tinkerer count. So I looked at the number of appearances of these villains in total, but also as the main villain. And after writing out the villains in every single Spider-Man game, counting everything up, the villain with the most appearances in Spider-Man games is Mysterio, with a whopping 17 appearances, which really surprised me. Not Green Goblin, not Doc Ock, Venom, Mysterio is the villain Spider-Man has fought more than any other in video games. Now, while it surprised me at first, it makes more sense the more I thought about it. Mysterio works well as a main boss for simple puzzle games like Spider-Man's earlier games, where Mysterio's practical effects lend itself for a puzzle setting, and his Hollywood connection allows for different set pieces and different stages in games. Then Mysterio can also be more of a joke character, allowing him to be a side villain of a game, a gimmick side piece. So this combination of good enough to be a main villain and also thriving as a side character caused him to appear in more Spider-Man games than any other villain. But he was only the main villain in 6 titles, not the most. The villain with the most appearances as the main villain in Spider-Man games was Green Goblin, being the main villain in 8 titles. Now, this makes sense to me. When I think of Spider-Man's greatest enemy, I think of Green Goblin. Google most fucked up things to happen to Peter Parker. You'll see this guy a lot. Also, he's the main villain in the first ever Spider-Man game and has a total of 12 appearances in Spider-Man games, meaning he was usually the main villain if he was in the game at all. But Green Goblin is the main villain in 3 of the mobile exclusive games, meaning for console and PC games, he's the main villain for only about 5 of them. And the second place guy for main villains is only the main villain on those console and PC games. That second place guy being Dr. Otto Octavius, Dr. Octopus, or Doc Ock, with 7 titles as the main villain. And if you're asking why I'm valuing console and PC games over mobile games, you probably don't play video games, and that's fine. Surprised you're here this far into the video. I appreciate it. But back to Ock, him being the main villain in this mini games makes sense. I think he's the only Spider-Man villain that can challenge Green Goblin for the title of #1 Spider-Man enemy. Also, he's probably Spider-Man's smartest villain, meaning he fits right into the mastermind level that story-based or complex games would likely need, which is why in every video game appearance of the Sinister Six, he's the brains behind the team and is usually the reason the team forms at all. So with his intelligence, notoriety, and popularity of the Sinister Six, Doc Ock is the second most used main villain and has a total of 15 appearances. Now, I think it's worth mentioning that Spider-Man, the Sinister Six from '96, has so little information on it, I couldn't in full confidence give that game a main villain, as I couldn't tell who the main villain was, but it probably was Doc Ock if I had to guess. So there's a very real chance that Green Goblin and Doc Ock are tied with 8 appearances as the main villain. But Green Goblin will still be crowned king of main villain appearances because I can't guarantee Doc Ock was the main villain in that Sinister Six game. Green Goblin was the first villain in any Spider-Man game, and all signs point to him being the main villain in Spider-Man 3, breaking that tie anyways. Although Insomniac always has 2 main villains in their games, and it's very possible Ock is also a main villain in that game, but whatever. But I'll just highlight some of the other Spider-Man villains, starting with Venom. Venom was the main villain in 6 titles and appeared in a total of 11 games, but in 2 of those appearances he wasn't a villain, leaving him with 9 villainous appearances, and only 3 as not the main villain, which makes sense. If you have Venom, highlight him, and make him a focal point. Venom's spawn, Carnage, was the main villain in 4 games, but appeared in 9 total. Makes sense, him being a blend of both main and minor. He could either be a force of nature that is a great threat, or a more mindless killer that needs to be stopped, but doesn't have the story weight to be considered the main villain. Now, if you want to count Anti-Venom and Edge of Time with the rest of the Venom appearances, that gives him 1 more villainous side role. There's also plenty of main villains in these Spider-Man games that only appeared in the 1 game where they're featured in, like Doctor Doom, Arcade, Evil Future Peter, and then just Hydra/New Enforcers. Now, all these make sense. Dr. Doom and Arcade were villains in crossover games, so we're less connected to the Spider-Man mythos, and the evil Future Peter and the Hydra/New Enforcers just being that game-specific storyline, and more original rather than being closer comic adaptations. But back to Spider-Man mythos, one of the most famous characters from that realm is Black Cat, who usually operates in more of a gray, so unsurprisingly, she's never been the main villain in any Spider-Man game, and since in these games, sometimes she's more villainous than others, I just decided to count all her appearances together to make things easier on myself, instead of analyzing her appearance and labeling her as good or bad. So her total game appearance is 10. Very impressive. Less impressive is that of some Sinister Six members, like Shocker and Hobgoblin with 8, Vulture with 9, but not as impressive as some of the more popular Sinister Six members like Sandman and Lizard with 11, Scorpion with 12, and Rhino with a whopping 14. But all these guys have never been the main villain in a game. Unsurprising as these guys are either too weak or boring to be the main villain in a game, or lacking motive to be that truly evil. And Rhino has the most appearances as a villain without being the main threat, which makes sense. Rhino is the perfect muscle for another villain to use. Now, some other notable Sinister Six members is Electro, who was the main villain in just one game, but has appeared in 12. Kraven, main villain in 1, and appeared in 6. Now, for disappointing number of appearances, we have Kingpin, who was the main villain for 2 games, although they were older games that didn't really capitalize on any deep-rooted crime in New York stories they could do, and has appeared in 6 total games, with mostly minor appearances, with his best portrayal being Web of Shadows, as even in a crisis, he will take any opportunity to gain power and better himself. Another popular Spider-Man villain with few appearances is Chameleon, one of Spider-Man's oldest villains, has an appearance count of only 3, and none as the main villain. And 2 of the 3, he's mostly teased and not really a factor, leaving Sinister Six, 96, the only game he's a villain in, and even then, I don't think it's much. Now, Insomniac's next Spider-Man game could change that, but for right now, Chameleon's done nothing in Spider-Man games, which isn't too surprising given his gimmick. You can only do so much with him in a video game, but if there's a team creative enough to make him work and be interesting, it would be Insomniac. Now, a surprising villain that was used was Alistair Smith, who was the main villain in 2 games and appeared in 5. I never heard of him before I worked on this video, and he had a real presence in these games, especially in the 90s. Here's the rest of the villain counts. But that's enough for the villains. Now, let's take a look at the systems these games have come out on and see which systems are more Spider-Man friendly than others. Now, for counting's sake, all the BBC Micros and ZX Spectrums I called out by name earlier are all going to be lumped in with PC. If that offends any computer nerds, I apologize, but it's just easier if I do that. And they look close enough to me. I don't know the differences. So the single system Spider-Man has appeared on the most is PC with 17 titles. How surprising and interesting. The system that's the easiest to make games for and sell has the most titles on it. The next closest system with a big drop-off is the Nintendo DS with 9. Which makes sense since for the longest time, superheroes were seen as something just for kids. So one of the kid-friendliest consoles of all time has the second most titles on it. Then 7 games on the Xbox 360 and 7 games on mobile. Now mobile is obvious, some are cash grabs, so that inflates their numbers, and then the Xbox 360 seems to have benefited from timing of its release compared to other console lines' generation upgrades. Other notable high counts, Genesis, Game Boy Advance, PlayStation 2 and 3, and Wii all have 6 titles to their names. Here's the rest of the individual consoles' games count. now, which console line or company has the most titles to their name? That honor goes to Nintendo with a whopping 22 titles. Maybe the most famous gaming company. It had a head start on PlayStation and Xbox lines and has both handheld and home systems, so it's no surprise it has such a high title count. But even if I separate Nintendo into home and handheld consoles, the top three would go Nintendo handhelds with 18, PC with 17, and then Nintendo home consoles with 16. Other notable high counts, PlayStation's got 14. Expect that number to keep climbing. Game Boys themselves have 12, multiple exclusives. DS line itself has 10, Xbox line has 9, and Sega has 8. Here's the rest of different console line counts.
Nathan, are you okay?
Now finally, we think of Spider-Man in a game setting fitting in perfectly with open-world games, having the freedom to swing around. But only 9 Spider-Man games are open-world. 9 out of 38. Now obviously the biggest reason for this is technological limitations in the early years of Spider-Man games. And once open world became realistic, most major Spider-Man games were open world, and it's since become the default for Spider-Man games. The first open world Spider-Man game was Spider-Man 2 in 2004. After that, 15 Spider-Man games came out. 8 of them were open world games, which at first doesn't sound like the biggest ratio, but when you take out the mobile games, it becomes greater, with 8 out of 11 of the non-mobile Spider-Man games being open world. Only exceptions being Friend or Foe, Shattered Dimensions, and Edge of Time. And honestly, when a Spider-Man game isn't open world, and you can't just swing around through a city, the game feels like it's missing something the whole time. You know, if you can't thwip your way through New York, what's the point? Being a hero? That's lame. But the current hands guiding Spider-Man games seem to understand how rewarding that freedom and movement can be. So that's the history of Spider-Man games. I really hope you've enjoyed it. This video is definitely up there for most work I've put into a video. So I really hope it turned out good enough for you. But going forward, I've decided to stream my way through every single major Spider-Man game, starting off with the very first, Spider-Man from 1982. So subscribe to join in on those. Let me know what other type of videos, maybe in this similar vein, you'd like to see from me. The only other superhero I could imagine having a multitude of games like Spider-Man would be Batman, and I'm kind of iffy on even that. But if you have any suggestions, anything you'd like to see me cover, maybe this style, just let me know down in the comments below. But that is going to do it for this video, so please like this video if you've made it this far. I'd really appreciate it. Subscribe for a lot more that's going to come. Check out some other of my videos. And as always, keep gaming. Also, almost forgot to mention, this video would not have been possible without me being able to use the footage from other YouTubers' playthroughs of all these different Spider-Man games. So I actually had footage of the games I was talking about to use. I only have a handful of those games I was able to play. Any of the games that I did play on this channel, I did use that footage for. But big shout outs and thank yous to anyone who let me use their footage. Everything should be linked below. Again, thank you to anyone who let me use their footage. I really appreciate it.